All right, good morning and welcome to this rescheduled meeting of the North Carolina Secretaries Science Advisory Board. This wasn't originally planned for August and delayed at the agency's request to allow for some other things to happen in between. Thanks, as usual, to Dr. Franny Nielsen for work with the agency leadership on putting the agenda together. To Paula for logistics, including parking passes for the members, and to Dylan, who was here even before I got here this morning at 9:30 working on IT support. And if folks listening online have any difficulties, please get a hold of Dylan Friedenberg through email or the chat. Thanks to the board members for attending. For continuing to volunteer your time in service to the two state agencies and the public we serve. I appreciate it. And I know that Detlef will be absent today. Dr. Knappe is in Australia. I expect David Howard, Jamie DeWitt, and Richard DeGiulio to attend by WebEx. And I saw that a couple of them were on already. I think Rich is going to be delayed in getting on. Those folks that are on by WebEx, and for those in the room, you can remind me periodically to check with them if I have gone too long in asking for them to chime in or take the opportunity to. And for any of you that are participating on WebEx, make sure you use the chat function or just interrupt so that we can make sure that you are able to participate that way. Let's see. I'll remind the agencies that we serve that have handled, I think all of us that are here today in 2017, that the charter calls for a board of as many as 16 people. We've had some departures through the years for various reasons. Doctors Bartram, Coates, Stoskopf, McDonald, Stopford, Dorman, and Tilson have moved on in one way or the other. I retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service in May. I have some extra time on my hands. I'll be glad to help out with maybe a couple of stage process of thinking about the desired attributes of board members, some combination of expertise, civic mindedness, willingness to serve, spending time between meetings to dig into the material, showing up at meetings, being vocal. And then, if we came to some agreement on the desired attributes, including the areas of expertise, that might help the brainstorming of names or the recruiting of people to serve. So that's something that's been on my mind lately as the size of the board has gotten where it is right now. Desired attributes, maybe driving the call for volunteers or who comes to mind that possesses those areas of expertise, civic mindedness, and the ability to spend the time to prepare between meetings in addition to at meetings. I'll reminder to everybody here on the board that the mics are live and to please use them when you're asking a question or fielding a question or making a statement. And when you're not using it, maybe tuck it away so that it doesn't interfere with the recording. And sometimes it helps if you're speaking, although those in the room know who you are from your name placards, to say it so that the recording reflects that for those that are listening and will listen in the future. So with that, I think we're ready to move on and review and approve the agenda. It was drafted by the state and sent by me last week. Are there any changes to the agenda that's being projected on the screen or which is identical to what was distributed? Or questions? Well, hearing none, it would be appropriate for a motion to adopt the agenda as drafted.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Thank you, Jamie. I heard you on the line. We can hear you fine. And I'll ask, it's a little out of order, whether there's any speakers signed up so far, just so that we can get them maybe in at the appropriate agenda time in case they have. All right. Well, we'll ask again at the public forum stage, but it was good to check that out. That takes us to the ethics statement, which perhaps Franny can pull up on the screen. If not, I can quickly get it to read it. Look at that. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it's the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So I will pause now and see if there is any feedback from that from the members today with regard to our agenda.
Hi, Tom. This is Jamie. I'd like to make a statement.
The floor is yours. We can hear you fine.
Great. I have funding from the state of North Carolina through the collaboratory and a civil word from Duke University to study the immunotoxicity of chemicals known as PFAS. I also recently received funding from the state of New Jersey to study immunotoxicity of PFAS, and I do serve as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS chemicals.
All right, thank you. We're definitely going to have some PFAS-related discussions today. We have the one action item, which isn't a PFAS chemical, but the rest of it is discussion only. So thanks for your declaration. I don't see that as a concern today with regard to the business that we have in front of us. Anyone else?
Tom, this is John Vandenberg. The couple of different things here. For 1,4-dioxane, the IRIS file that was part of the basis for the discussion was developed by the division that I was the division director of back in 2011, I think, some time ago. I also am listed as a contributor to the report. I was a reviewer of the report that the state developed. And then finally, I've served last year as an expert witness for the state in a case related to 1,4-dioxane.
Thank you, John. I think there's several of us that are listed as a reviewer or contributor to the state's report. That is an action item today. I don't know whether we will make it so far as to have a vote. I would encourage anybody who is associated with it to at least participate at the level of providing any clarity for questions that come up of a technical nature, and then can decide when it comes to a vote about your level of participation. But as experts in the subject matter, we'd probably benefit from at least participation in the discussion. Appreciate the disclosure. Any others? All right. I think that moves us on to the next item on the agenda, item number 4, which is approval of the meeting minutes from April. Those were sent by me last week. Are there any changes or questions or suggestions about the draft minutes?
Tom, John Vandenberg, I really just want to say I appreciate the minutes. They're well done. And the links to the recording are very, very helpful. So thank you for that.
Thanks to staff for that.
Well, I can take no credit for that and pass that on to the agency staff that created them. So it's been a good evolution. It keeps them concise, and it does help to be able to go listen to what it was said as opposed to having to repeat it all in minutes. Anything else? Any questions on minutes from Jamie or David?
Nothing from me, Tom. This is Jamie.
And David?
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. It would be appropriate then for a motion to approve the minutes of the April meeting as drafted.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded by John and Elena. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Great. I heard the two people online. Anyone opposed? And anyone abstaining? All right. Well, that bit of business is done, and that'll be our first action item for the agency staff is to post the final minutes at the board's website. That moves us on to agency updates. I didn't have a time before this meeting to find out which of the agencies we serve is going to go first. We have DEQ and DHHS. Sounds like that we're going to be joined by Virginia Guidry, the branch head for occupational and environmental epidemiology for DHHS, to give us that agency update. Good morning, Virginia.
That's fine. I'll just. Okay, thanks, Franny. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Virginia Guidry, head of occupational and environmental epidemiology at DHHS, here on behalf of Dr. Zach Moore, our state epidemiologist, and others at DHHS to share our updates and any input needed today. I will start with a brief federal funding update. Currently, all the federal funding for our branch, the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch, for the past fiscal year has been received. And so we are continuing to function basically as normal. That covers approximately 70% of our positions in the branch. And you may know this, but DHHS as a whole is about 79% federally funded. So we are watching with great interest what happens with the federal shutdown and any potential impacts both to our federal positions or federally funded programs. And then, of course, also to our colleagues at CDC and EPA, whom we work with on a regular basis. So waiting to see the impacts there. Within the branch, we do have a couple of new web tools, which I can share the links for maybe with Franny for the minutes later. One is a fish advisory story map. And so it's basically an interactive web page where you can look at locations around the state and see both statewide and site-specific advisories. We also have a private well and health story map that's new, and that provides private well testing and treatment guidance and links to our Be Well Informed tool, which residents can use to interpret their results when they receive private well testing results. And then we also have downloadable county level data in that tool as well. We get asked quite a bit for well testing result data from around the state. And so we are working hard to have that available to folks who require it and just have it downloadable to them. So that's available in our tool. We recently completed a community assessment for public health emergency response, or CASPER survey that was in Buncombe County, where Asheville is, following Hurricane Helene. We conducted the survey in June, and it's actually a household survey. We selected a sample of representative households across Buncombe County, both urban and rural, and went to those households, stood on people's front porches and asked them questions about their current health needs at that point, whether they had to evacuate for Helene, any impacts they were facing. And we are on the verge of releasing those impacts and results with Buncombe County. Buncombe County is the lead on that with our support. And so those results will be coming out from Buncombe County Health and Human Services any day now. We are also currently reviewing the most recent papers on fluoride in drinking water. That has been a topic here at the SAB meetings. And our epidemiology and toxicology teams are currently reviewing those papers that have been discussed somewhat before. For 1,4-dioxane, NCDHHS did receive a request to establish a preliminary health goal for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water from the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority. We also received letters from the City of Wilmington, New Hanover County Board of Commissioners, and the Southern Environmental Law Center in support of that request. We are currently discussing and addressing that request, although a response has not yet gone back to CFPUA, but we are working on that right now. We also continue our work to support areas of the state that face environmental justice concerns. We co-lead the Governor's Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where we are trying to document promising practices that help to bring economic opportunities and promote health in areas of our state that are disproportionately impacted by environmental issues. We're also carrying out the DHHS environmental justice goals, which include increasing interactions with local health departments and other partners around environmental quality, increasing the inclusion of environmental health and quality in community health assessments, and helping to address private well contamination and septic system failures around the state. As we head into fall here, we are wrapping up our heat season. One of the things that DHHS does is we track heat-related illness around the state. And since May 1st, we have documented over 5,600 emergency department visits for heat-related illness statewide. That's an average weekly rate of 2.6 cases per 100,000 people. This is 1,400 more emergency department visits this year compared to the same time period last year. And especially in North Carolina, it was the first half of the summer where you might recall we had some very extreme heat, and that is one of the time periods where we saw the most emergency department visits. We've also been getting some questions about this and working with climate partners about the increase in temperatures in the fall. You may notice that our summer heat is starting to kind of bleed into the fall as well. And we are in fact seeing an average increase of 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit in fall temperatures from 1970 to now. There's charts that are showing that increase over time on average. And although we are seeing those average increases here in the South, actually some parts of the country are increasing even more on average than we are. And as part of our tracking of heat-related illness, we also run a statewide heat health alert system, and we send out heat alerts when heat health thresholds are exceeded, along with educational materials. So we've been very active sending out those alerts this season as well. The last thing that I'll mention is we are currently carrying out a water filter distribution initiative. This is led by our North Carolina Environmental Public Health Tracking Program and our private well and health team. And we use the tool that I mentioned earlier for private well results and health concerns to identify communities that are at higher risk of private well contamination in several areas of the state. And then based on that, our environmental public health tracking team partnered with the EJ Community Action Network in Sampson County, as well as the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation in Alamance County, and provided over 500 countertop water pitchers and extra filters for distributions to households that have contaminated private well water. And those pitcher filters go along with educational materials and a survey to ask about usability and provide feedback to us on that process. But our goal there is to provide low cost, easy to maintain treatment for households that need it. And with that, I will conclude and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guidry, for your remarks. I'll start, and then I'm going to move next to folks on the phone, David, Jamie, and Gina, if she's been able to join, to give you guys a chance to ask questions if you have any. I understand you're considering the Cape Fear Public Utilities Authority's request, so I don't need an answer on that, but I did want to find out, can you just remind the board what a preliminary health goal is, and maybe just a synopsis of whether it's advisory or what regulatory power it has, just so that we know more about the tool that was requested and your consideration of it.
Sure. Yeah. A preliminary drinking water health goal is basically a health recommendation that's developed in the absence of a regulation or a drinking water standard that can be used for drinking water supplies. You likely recall that we did develop one for Gen X, 140 parts per trillion back in the start of the awareness of the PFAS contamination in the Cape Fear River and those initial questions. So we were basically asked to provide an additional recommendation now for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. And good news is there's been a lot of work around that topic, as we'll discuss today. So we have a lot more to draw upon than back in the Gen X days when it was a very new issue. So that's what we're looking at to develop our recommendation.
Gotcha. So let me ask David or Jamie or Gina, if you've been able to join, any questions for Dr. Guidry? And if not, I'll move on to folks in the room.
Hi, this is Jamie. I don't have any questions. I just want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing in spite of the challenges that everybody in public health is facing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Anything from David or Dina?
No questions from me. Thank you.
Thank you, David. All right. Any questions from folks in the room? John and then Elena.
Thank you very much. It's a lot of work you're doing. I think it's great. Could you kind of position the review of the board's discussion here today about 1,4-dioxane and how that relates to the preliminary health goal? Just how does this process work in the state in terms of the development and the review and the approval of that?
I think the discussion today will be really important for the HHS just to have another piece of information and where the board stands on that scientific information that's available. I think we have already been considering that and the discussion from earlier in our own internal deliberations. So I think it's another very helpful piece and additional information for us as we continue to determine our response.
So does the preliminary health goal get approved by the Environmental Management Commission or somebody who approves it?
So at this point, we are evaluating the need for that and whether there's enough existing information or not. So we're actually basically trying to determine whether it is warranted at this time or not. So we're kind of a few steps back from that.
So it's a goal, it's not an enforceable standard, is that
Right,
right?
correct,
Okay.
correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Not approved by the EMC. Right.
Elena?
I was just curious about if you can refresh my memory on where they might be going with fluoride, as in looking at a change in what's allowed to be put in water, changes in goal standards, anything like that?
So at the moment, you'll no doubt recall that we had a legislative request last year. We worked with you all and submitted a response to that legislative request last December. At the moment, as additional information comes out, we are continuing to review that information, but not at the moment addressing any specific requests around that. We're basically evaluating the information that's coming in.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And Viney?
Thank you very much, Tom. This is Vinay Aneja. First of all, I do want to thank you for the summary that you have provided us. My question revolves around two issues, one dealing with climate and the second dealing with environmental justice.
Mhm.
And you both partner with and get assistance from the federal government on both those two issues. I'm just curious to know, in the current cycle of what's going on, how are you filling the gap for both of these two issues? You meaning the state of North Carolina,
Mhm.
Since federal government is sort of not there at the seat.
So health equity is really one of the foundational principles behind public health. Part of the purpose of providing public health programs is to try to address those folks who are most in need. So I think that's really part of our mission at the Department of Health and Human Services. And so we are doing our best to continue that mission in a variety of ways, including consideration for environmental impacts and those impacts on health. I think, we have received some directives from the federal government to change directions on that work. In fact, we had an environmental justice grant from the EPA that was terminated. And so there are some changes. However, that principle of really trying to address those who have the greatest needs is still behind the work that we're doing. And there's still plenty of interest in that, of course, plenty of need for that. So we're trying to continue that work and just focus on those topics where there are those needs. So I mentioned, private well contamination, for example. Septic systems are another big one where there are septic system failures. They're very expensive to treat. Trying to work on that topic as well, along with partners at DEQ and others at DHHS who work on that topic more than I do. So we are still focusing on those topics where there are great needs and applying our resources and expertise as we can to address those topics.
And how about climate?
So, for climate change, we still are funded by the CDC to do our Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program. That's the program that tracks heat-related illness and sends out the heat alerts and has provided fans, cooling fans to lower income areas and is engaged in a number of other issues across state agencies. So again, we're continuing to do that work because we are seeing the health impacts of extreme heat. We're seeing the health impacts of flooding. We're seeing, the health impacts of various types of extreme weather. So again, those needs are there. And so we're working to document them and address them to the extent that we're able, and try to work with, state and local partners to figure out the best strategies to do that, in the current climate. No pun intended.
Thank you for your questions, Vinay. Tom, did you have anything? All right. Well, thank you.
I
Briefly.
would just like to say, I really appreciate what you said about the equity issues, because I think it's so important, despite what the federal government is doing and the directives that are coming and the funds that are being cut. And I really, your attitude towards that, I think I really just want to applaud that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guidry.
Thank you.
We'll move on to agency updates from DEQ, and it looks like we're joined by Deputy Secretary for the Environment, Sushma Masemore. Good morning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the board. And as always, I want to start off with sincere thank you and appreciation for the time and effort you spend in guiding and providing us advice and recommendations and your thoughts as we do our jobs. I'm going to cover 3 topics. One, as always, forever chemicals, PFAS particularly. Second, I'm going to cover a few updates on 1,4-dioxane. That has been something that you all have been hearing about for some time now. And then third, I'll do a high-level overview of our climate change-related initiatives on the mitigation side and the resilience side. Starting with PFAS, I wanted to give you an update on the regulatory front, both at the state level as well as the federal level. As you know, that EPA under the previous administration established the drinking water standards for PFAS chemicals, a select group of them. Under the new administration, they have announced plans to retain at least the MCLs, the maximum contaminant levels for PFOA and PFAS while they review the remaining. And today you're going to hear from our staff what the state of North Carolina has done in order to get our state ready for the implementation of those drinking water standards under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Secondly, the 2 regulatory areas that are under the purview of the state are groundwater standards. You heard in the past about North Carolina taking an initiative with the Environmental Management Commission to establish PFAS groundwater standards. Our current rule already requires us to regulate any contaminants in groundwater that's above what we call a practical quantification limit. The rulemaking activities we proposed to EMC, they adopted in the last EMC gathering in September of this year. So now we have codified, I would say, now we have adopted green PFAS standards for PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X. Those are now regulated at the levels that are at the PQL, but also for Gen X, it's at the 10 parts per trillion. So in summary, you'll hear about that from Bridget, what that process looked like and what that final outcome is and how we're proceeding with the implementation of that. Thirdly, we talked a little bit about The authority we have as a department under the drinking water, I'm sorry, under the Drinking Water Act, and that is the surface water rules. These are the dischargers of industrial pollution and other wastewater treatment facilities that discharge to the waters of the state. Those regulations are under the purview of the Division of Water Resources. In the past, we have presented an approach to establish PFAS standards, drinking water standards. I'm sorry, I would say water quality standards. Thank you for being patient with me. And those standards did not proceed forward. Instead, the EMC requested us to come out with a rulemaking for minimizing and monitoring for PFAS from these dischargers. For the past year or so, we have been working with the EMC through our Division of Water Resources to present a potential rulemaking package that has been gone through many discussions and many meetings. At the last cycle, we received approval to proceed from the Office of State Management and Budget. It's a fiscal analysis for that rulemaking. So the EMC may choose to hear in the coming meeting on what that minimization and monitoring rulemaking could entail for the third group of sources that I mentioned. Finally, during all of this, we also are working towards sampling and testing private wells at the request of those homeowners and other businesses. Our Division of Waste Management has the Bernard Allen program that they implement. This is a program that the legislature has authorized us to provide testing and other services for private well users. We work with our partners in DHHS in sampling and analyzing what the results are and communicating what the homeowners' options are if there are elevated levels. Through that work, we have been able to identify a few areas of focus, and those areas of focus are scattered across the state. Some of them have required the homeowners to be on filtration systems, while others we're working with other resources to get them connected to municipal supply. Granted, some of those municipal supplies may also have PFAS, which are covered under the drinking water standards, and they will ultimately have to come into compliance in the future. But holistically, we are working to support those home sites where wells are detected to be above at least the MCLs for which there are regulated standards. And then in the future, we can go into more details about what these locations are. Secondly, we have come to you all on Comores related updates. I wanted to, if it's okay, Jared will pull up a map of the most recent updates to our Comores private well testing program. In the last meeting, I had conveyed that we had expanded the near facility. And that is, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, this is our lower eastern part of North Carolina, including about 10 counties or so. If you look at the northwest portion of this map, the red areas in the center of that is the Comores Fayetteville Works facility. The blue area is now what we call the expanded delineated boundaries, where additional home sites will be identified and offered private well testing under the consent order. The results, the reds and the greens, indicate what we have found thus far since the signing of the consent order. So we're about 6 years into the implementation of the consent order. If you see the pink area in the middle, this is the floodplain area that we worked with our communities and the facility to identify additional areas where contamination may have spread through the flooding in the past storms that have historically moved contamination and water across different areas. And then on the bottom right, you'll see the lower four counties, what we call the lower Cape Fear region. This is the New Hanover County, Brunswick County, Pender and Columbus County areas that we required Comores in 2023 to further assess the extent of their contamination. That assessment process was lengthy. we completed that review of their analysis and the results. And we are now requiring them to test in that area. There's a boundary. It's this light green.
I can zoom in on that area too.
Yeah. And so that is our latest announcement to the public, that 14 to 15,000 additional home sites will be now eligible for testing. Theoretically, they may qualify for, under the consent order, about 2 to 3, maybe 4,000 home sites. We're really not sure, but right now the word has gone out through communications and outreach. We will be having a public virtual meeting next week to convey this to this general area if they have any questions and how best to get access to the services. So I wanted to give you that update on the Camor site. There's many other ongoing compliance-related activities near and away from the site that are in the consent order and outside, including a few permit applications that are renewals and modifications that we have received in the recent months for us to review. So we will be giving you updates as that review process moves forward. It will have significant public interest in that too. Also, you heard about our conversations that in the lower Cape Fear, that's mainly the blue area, that the primary trigger point for qualifications in the consent order is the chemical PFMOAA. This is the Camor signature compound that is above 10 parts per trillion that we are detecting in that lower Cape Fear. And it is also the chemical that we've been coming to you for additional scientific review and analysis for how the state can use the available literature to potentially develop some screening criteria or advisory levels to be able to help guide us as to what is a safe level for that chemical. We had worked with the Office of Research and Development to finish their analysis of the work that Dr. Justin Conley presented to you. With the ORD in the current state and possibly with it going, with some of this work being moving forward or not, we're still trying to figure out where it's left off. And as soon as we determine the fate of that, depending on if EPA is able to give us a complete piece of work on PFMOA, we'll come back to you all. Our thought is if it's incomplete, we may still come to you all for perhaps finishing that work and doing our own state level analysis. So just a heads up that might be coming depending on where we are at. Also, I mentioned a little bit with the Environmental Management Commission. It's an ongoing conversation on the surface water rules. We also did 2 separate studies, special studies under the department's available resources. One was to do the fish study that you heard about in the Cape Fear River, and then there's the analysis that we completed for the saltwater fish. And today, Franny will be talking about the findings of that. There we have received many inquiries on what our results are, and we felt like the data had been analyzed sufficiently to be able to present, and we'll go over that today. Another study that we funded was related to the generation of biosolids from wastewater treatment facilities. Biosolids are generated from publicly operated treatment facilities as well as industrial activities if they have a wastewater treatment operations. We tested those select sites and evaluated what we're seeing. We're getting many, many questions on what our findings are. We're finishing up with that study review and the results, and in the coming weeks, we will be releasing that, coming to you all as well as the Environmental Management Commission and various stakeholders to communicate our findings and answer the public's questions. I also wanted to announce that the Collaboratory and the DEQ have a fellowship program, and this allows the academic community to work on a daily basis through a semester, not on a full-time basis, but on a as available basis, to work within the DEQ offices with our division staff on important topics or complex issues that they're interested and we are struggling with as a state. And so this year, in the fall round, Dr. David Genero from the NC State will be hosted, and he will be conducting groundwater-related PFAS research and applied science work with Franny and our Jared, as well as our Division of Water Resources and our Division of Waste Management. At the federal front, there has been one important announcement that I just wanted to convey to you all. In the previous administration, they had designated PFOA, and PFOS as hazardous substances. The EPA recently in September reaffirmed or retained the designation classification as hazardous substance for those two chemicals. And this is an important federal decision because this sets the requirements under the Superfund law on what the polluters requirements are for cleanup. And so we are waiting for EPA to follow up with additional actions on how the agency sees moving forward for that. And I will pause on the PFAS if there are any questions before I go into a high-level 1,4-dioxane overview.
Let me ask first for any questions from folks on the phone, and I'll pause too to thank Dylan for helping Gina connect. And Board Member Kimball has joined us by the WebEx. Any questions on the PFAS updates from Deputy Secretary Mace-Moore from folks on the phone?
Hi, this is Jamie. I have just a quick question, and I don't know if Secretary Mace-Moore can answer it on the fly. But since 2017, do you have a rough estimate of how much time and effort in terms of person hours DEQ has spent on Chemours-related PFAS?
Let me just say it's probably over 4 digits. It would take a long time.
I would expect so.
Maybe even 5 digits. Yes, I would say yes. Many, many hours for one site, one permitted facility.
Gina or David, any questions on the PFAS updates?
This is David. No questions. Thank you.
This is Gina. No questions. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Any brief questions from folks in the room so that we can move on to 1,4-dioxane? John?
The minimization and monitoring rule, is that being used in other cases, or is that specifically here for PFAS?
Right now, that concept is being pursued for both PFAS and 1,4-dioxane.
And 1,4-dioxane, okay. Thank you.
And Tom, any questions so far?
No questions.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Dina,
Thank
go
you very
ahead.
much, Tom. Thank you very much, Secretary Mace-Moore. My question is, what prompted DEQ to expand coverage of PFAS testing in other locations, principally in the southeast area of North Carolina along the coast? What triggered this to happen?
A very good question. We knew from air deposition that pollution had traveled.
Okay.
And the prevailing wind would have carried to that area. So we knew the potential existed. We did receive through our own testing that DEQ does across the state. We have groundwater wells, and the community itself, CFPUA particularly, tested a lot of their wells, and homeowners have been concerned. That's where it's all started. In fact, it was in the Wilmington region that the NC State folks determined that PFAS was prevalent in the southeast. What we didn't have is a better understanding of the extent of the Chemours signature compounds there. And as soon as we had that data through our own analysis of enough private wells, we issued a letter to Chemours. I believe it was at the end of 2023 that said, there's enough evidence. We need you to develop an assessment of how that would be characterized. And because there are so many potential pathways for that contamination to go all the way from the site to down to the coast, we all prioritized 4 different criteria. One of them was the floodplain that I mentioned, the flooding that could spread the contamination. Another was the leaking pipes through which the source water is pumped from the Cape Fear and then traveled across the different pumping stations as well as the homeowners. So that those leaking pipes also distributes the contamination. And we did find many evidence that homeowners or along those lines were affected from the contamination. Third was the spreading of the biosolids. Any land application of sludge and waste from Camor site could have been a requirement. And then the fourth was ASR wells, which are used for groundwater retention of drinking water. They were contaminated. So we prioritize at least 4 different pathways, and out of that, the map we just showed you is the current testing area. There's a lot of work still.
So if I may.
Briefly.
Considering Comores has put together air filtration unit to filter out as much of the PFAS as possible. And if I understand right, it's 99% or some very high number. And, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And considering that PFAS is also a forever chemical, this problem will last for generations to come. And how do we deal with it?
It is the challenge of our times. But I will say, Dr. David Genero, one of the studies analysis he's doing is the consent order allows 20 years of service to the affected homeowners. So replacement filters or payment for municipal connection. The question is, what's going to happen? What are we going to see in that contaminated water 20 years from now? And that is a source of additional scientific work, whether the decline in the contamination will reach to acceptable health levels.
But the acceptable health level is 10 parts per trillion, as you mentioned earlier. Are all of these places exceeding 10 parts per million, or you're just simply seeing PFAS in there?
So for the Comores, the consent order has criteria. So any one at 10 parts per trillion or combined over 70.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions, Vinay. Let's move on to your 1,4-dioxane update.
Okay, so as we just heard, for 1,4-dioxane, we also were pursuing water quality standards approach. The EMC has requested us to work on monitoring and minimization of 1,4-dioxane from those affected sources. And what I mean by this is these are dischargers of wastewater. And we prepared a rulemaking package and a fiscal note, and that has been certified and approved, and it's in front of the committee to consider for how they would like to proceed with. While that has happened, we are also going through some litigation. There is a challenge in the North Carolina State Superior Court. The department is defending a permit that had 1,4-dioxane effluent limits, and that is moving forward in the North Carolina court. There was also a request made to EPA on that same permit, and as a result, EPA is having a public hearing on the issuance of the Asheboro permit that was issued by the department, and that public hearing, the EPA Region 4 will be holding on October 22nd at the Randolph Community College at 6 p.m. We have heard also that EPA plans to re-review the health assessment of 1,4-dioxane and perhaps even look at the methodology and the framework under which all health assessments are conducted. We can't find anything on the website, and we're still trying to get more information on the timing and the scope of that work, but it could be something that is done at the federal level for this chemical and perhaps others. But with all of that, I want to affirm our need for your work that we have in front of you that we started many months ago, which is based on what is out there, what is published, and the work that has been done by some of you in the external scientific community and the department. What does this board say regarding the scientific reasonableness of the conclusions? And Franny will talk about that. And I just wanted to convey the importance of that work. It will evolve as many of these things are proceeding in the legal realm as well as at the federal level. Any questions on that?
I'll just ask, and you don't have to answer it now. Maybe Franny will cover it, or you can bring it up when the topic comes up about whether or not, given the rule package for 1,4-dioxane, the EPA pending review and the litigation, whether there'd be any change in charge for the work that's before the board, given the passage of time since that charge was made in December. And I think each of those things you mentioned has probably happened since December.
Mm-hmm.
And last time we had a chance to visit about it was April. So the charge is pretty clear. It's also quite narrow.
Yes, I think at this point, the charge is still very adequate and appropriate because all of this work that I just mentioned is relying on the same foundational scientific material. It is just being interpreted and discussed at a different level. And so those discussions will, and the court discussions could end up in a different place, but this board is helpful in helping us look at it from just the scientific perspective of what the data and information tells us.
Thank you.
Okay. And then I'm going to conclude with a little bit on the climate-related updates. As you all know, that EPA proposed a rescission of the endangerment finding for greenhouse gases, and associated with that were the repeal of the greenhouse gas vehicle standards. These have been the first climate change-related greenhouse gas reduction regulations associated with those pollutants that EPA took action. We reviewed the analysis. Our Division Air Quality submitted a comment letter in the docket, and I wanted to just communicate and share one of the key findings from that review. At a high level, we did not get into the endangerment finding. There are other entities that are doing that, but we really focused on the GHG standards. The standards themselves have achieved not only greenhouse gas reductions, but reductions of other criteria and toxic pollutants. And as a result of repealing or removing those standards, the administration's analysis did not show the disbenefit to NOx and SO2 and VOC emissions. And what we did was conduct a limited mobile source modeling analysis for Mecklenburg County and evaluated or estimated if those standards are removed, what the NOx and VOC and SO2 emissions and change would be in the absence of those standards. And it was noticeable enough and quantifiable enough that we included that as a major request to the agency to relook because states like North Carolina, especially in our Mecklenburg area, are, as you know, are in attainment of the ozone standard and all NACs for criteria pollutants. But we are at a very sensitive area on the ozone side for that Mecklenburg County area, and that any changes or any increases in those could be a maintenance issue for the state. So we did submit that very important finding. I don't know if that's out there, but that is something I wanted to convey to the audience and the team, that it is not just the GHG standards that were affected, but also our ability to regulate and reduce NOx out of what we call foundational controls for criteria pollutants. Another high-level update I wanted to give is on the resiliency side. We, as a department, have been doing a lot of work related to building our climate change resiliency capacity at the state level and also at the department. Related to Hurricane Helene, that has been not only the hurricane after hurricane that we've been able to perfect our services and where we do our work. But Helene has been an unprecedented storm, and the response has required an unprecedented number of man hours, but also creative thinking and the kind of services that we've never had to deploy. So for example, we've had many water and wastewater systems and septic systems that failed, unmeasurable amount of debris that required removal and management. And as a result of that, we've really had to figure out how do we rebuild and recover and be able to respond to a storm like this in the future in a more resilient way. So through the congressional funding, North Carolina received about $650 million for centralized septic systems, water and wastewater systems to be upgraded for Helene. All of those projects are being deployed through our department, and that is being done through a resilient lens in the future. How do we make those water systems more resilient from future storms? Similar activities are occurring with our Division of Waste Management through another grant for hazardous waste and our brownfields program and the recycling program. And that's funding we received out of the Congressional Appropriations Act. And then the last I wanted to update you all is, you may know Dr. Kathy Della, who was at the NC State Climate Office as the state climatologist. She's now our Assistant Secretary for Resiliency at DEQ, and she will be leading some of this work that I just mentioned, including more on making our department and our state more resilient to future extreme weather conditions. And Kathy was started just 3 weeks ago. So that's all for that.
Thank you for your comments. Are there any questions from board members for Deputy Secretary Masemore?
I have just one. Would you be willing to share that letter that you sent to EPA?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. That would be very
Interested in that as
useful.
well. The disbenefit analysis, I'd like to see that.
Sure.
And any questions from folks on the phone?
All right, thank you for giving me the time.
Tell me what the name of that letter is so that I can capture it for the action items, please. Or a way to characterize it. Doesn't have to be the name, just a descriptive name.
Yeah, I would just call it EPA proposal to rescind endangered refining and greenhouse gas vehicle standards.
That's a lot.
All right, you could say EPA greenhouse gas standards rulemaking. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That'll work fine. Thanks. All right. That moves us. Thank you both agencies for the updates. We appreciate it. That moves us on to our first business item, which is a revisiting of an item that we had previously, the human health risk assessment for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. While Franny's getting that teed up, I'm just going to remind us where we have been on that. The document that we've been asked to review is a final document. It was finalized last April, and we were asked last December about its scientific foundations and whether or not it had, in addition to its goal of meeting a legislative mandate, did it have any independent utility as the state moves forward with science-guided management. In particular, when Franny gets around to showing us the slides, you'll see the charge, which was specifically, we've been asked to determine whether or not the document is scientifically reasonable. That may be kind of a pass-fail for a final document. It's not a draft. We're not being asked to edit it. We're being asked to say, in addition to its work to inform the legislature that requested it, does it have utility? Is it scientifically reasonable moving forward? So we approached that a number of ways after getting that charge in December. At and before the April meeting, we had both an opportunity for open feedback. And then at the April meeting, we walked through elements of a review that could be considered to comprise scientific reasonableness for a risk assessment. We asked questions about the methods used, the data and assumptions, and the conclusions and recommendations. Captured in the draft are some of the questions that we actually asked to make sure that it wasn't just general impressions. We asked questions at the April meeting and paused between them for feedback on, are the data reliable and adequate, clearly described, properly cited and referenced? Are the methods appropriate and were they described clearly in sufficient detail to allow for replication? We asked in particular about the drinking water exposure pathway, whether that had been well characterized, whether the hazard data that were used were clear and adequate, whether the use of a cancer slope factor was reasonable, whether the dose response relationships were appropriate and supported by the data, and were the conclusions consistent with the evidence. There was a summary following the April meeting that was prepared and distributed to board members for review, both to get feedback from the folks that were absent at that meeting, as well as for the people that were present to review the tone and level of detail in the language that we used to summarize a long meeting and their input. Since that draft was distributed, I heard from board members Howard and DeJulia that they have no further suggested edits to the draft board summary. I did hear yesterday about a concern with the EPA assessment that's used as a foundation for the hazard assessment portion of the state's 2024 report. So I'm going to suggest a path forward today is that we have Franny tee back up, hopefully briefly, given the passage of time so far this morning. I think we're going to lose Jamie here in a little bit, so it'd be good to move along if we can. Tee back up the request that was given to the board. And then I'm going to suggest that we pause and see if there's any other technical topics that folks want to bring up, not to discuss them, but to inventory them. Then we'll pause for the second issue that came up, revisit that one in detail. And then once we hear whether or not there's any other technical issues, we can decide how to budget the remaining time for today. I had envisioned not getting any comments by the requested deadline that would be moving toward a vote on the suggested language. I don't think that serves the agencies well when there's a technical issue on the table. But I also don't want to jump right into that technical issue without hearing whether or not there's any more. So that's the proposed path forward, and an overview from Franny, a last call for technical feedback topics, a revisiting of the topic that came up yesterday, and then a path forward based on how much we have to discuss. Does that seem reasonable? All right. Well, Franny, it's yours to tee this issue back up, given the passage of time.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So you'll notice on the slide that the date is from April of this year, and I chose to leave that here. This is the exact same slide presentation I gave in April. And so just for simplicity's sake, I left the date on it for you. Okay, so the legislative report that the state did came under a pretty close timeline. This is a brief history of the details. In September of 23, the General Assembly directed DEQ to prepare a human health risk assessment of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water supported by peer-reviewed studies, specifically relating to the cancer slope factor and the derivation of that value, including the cancer slope factor. In December of 23, the Science Advisory Board discussed the difficulty of meeting this timeline and recommended a strategy to utilize to meet the requirements in the time given. And this was the EPA's framework for human health risk assessment for decision-making purposes. In January of 24, DEQ started these activities following the recommendations of the board. The suggestions were to convene a group of experts and begin the directed activities. We did that in a few short months, and in the very first day of May of 24, we delivered the assessment to the Joint Legislative Commission on Governmental Affairs Operations. And so this report was done in a short time frame, and the framework from the EPA that the board suggested we use and we ended up utilizing was the driving mechanism of how this was done so quickly and with the explicit purpose of the directive to look at this compound in drinking water. Okay, and so then we had a request to the board. And this is the text on the slide has been modified since what I presented in April. This is what was posted to the website after the board's discussion. So this is the most up-to-date slide, but still from April of this year. The request was that the board review this legislative report that we provided to the General Assembly and provide formal feedback whether the approach of the report and the findings of the report are scientifically reasonable. Recall that this report was produced at the request of the General Assembly and has been submitted. The ask of the board now is to provide some retrospective feedback on this report's scientific adequacy as a foundation for health-based water quality management. Since the report has been submitted about 1.5 years ago, we're not seeking edits at this time. The only future in which I envision we will be revising that report is if the EPA revises their IRIS assessment and the General Assembly provides a new directive to revise it. But it was a directive from the General Assembly, and so we will wait till further direction if they want that revised. We're interested in the feedback regarding whether or not, this product is scientifically sound and whether the cancer slope factor that is used in the hazard evaluation section, as well as its derivation, are appropriate. Your attention is drawn to the cancer slope factor because that is the aspect of the report that is used to determine the health-based concentration for a lifetime of exposure. And then the last slide is just the link to the report. That's
Thank you, Franny. So you can back it up one slide, please, to the charge, and maybe just leave that up there. Because as I asked during Deputy Secretary Mace-Moore's presentation, was there any indication of broadening or narrowing the charge given the other actions? And it sounds like that we heard that charge was still appropriate. So that was step one. Step two is to then ask board members, and I'll start with people on the phone, whether or not there's any other technical issues that you'd like to bring up before we would move on to discussing the one that arose yesterday, which is all a precursor to revisiting the language of the draft summary. So folks on the phone, any other technical concerns before we move forward?
None from Jamie.
For me either.
This is Gina. I have none.
All right. And then that opens it up for board members in the room. Any other feedback? I'm going backwards with intention. The Presbyterian in me likes to do things decently and in order. And although we had a process to, collect feedback and work toward a synthesis, I do value the technical feedback whenever it comes up. And I think that we're best serving the state by grappling with the technical issues, even if they're a little out of sequence, than simply moving along. But before we jump into the one that arose yesterday, anybody else in the room have any other technical issues you want to put on the table? All right, then let's hear about the one that arose yesterday.
Do I have a chance to speak now?
Of course.
Okay. I'm the guy who's responsible for this late expression of concern. And it originated in my reexamination of the report, and in particular focusing on the table 3 in the report that compares 4 different approaches to assessing risk and setting a safe exposure level. EPA's cancer approach, EPA's non-cancer approach, Health Canada, and the ATSDR approach to non-cancer. And in that table, there is a row called health-based criterion, in which the EPA cancer slope factor is presented, except it's described as 0.1 milligrams per kilogram per day, not 0.1 per milligram per kilogram per day, which is what a slope factor would be. It would be a risk per unit of exposure. And that's consistent with the exposure measures of the other three entries in this, a reference dose for non-cancer, tolerable daily intake from Health Canada for non-cancer, and the ATSDR minimal risk level for non-cancer. So without that slash for per, or the word per, it makes the cancer slope factor almost automatically comparable to the others in terms of units, which is not correct, because the health-based criterion that EPA's cancer approach would use would be the risk probability of 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 10,000. It would be the dose level associated with those risks, either one or another. And in this case, it's 1 in a million that's been chosen. So there was an inconsistency there that I thought could easily be misinterpreted. And I, in fact, am guilty of having misinterpreted what was going on in that table. I thought, gee, these numbers are all alike, very similar. And in fact, they're not. The cancer risk is much, much lower, higher at these exposure levels than this makes it out to be. So I dug in a little bit and went to the IRIS risk evaluation document, the risk assessment summary, to see where this slope factor comes from of 0.1 per milligram per kilogram per day. And the dose response data surprised me in terms of what it indicates about dose response relationships. It's for female mouse liver tumors, hepatocellular adenoma and adenocarcinoma, or carcinoma combined. And the control group, 5 out of 50 animals showed those lesions. At the low dose, 35 out of 50, that's 70%, showed those lesions. The mid dose, 82%, 41 out of 50 showed those lesions. And finally, the high dose, 92%, 46 out of 50 showed those lesions. And that automatically set alarm bells off in my head that this is a high dose experiment that may have been too high. And it raised the question of whether or not there is any useful information that can be extracted from it with regard to the shape of the curve below the 50% response level, and in particular below even a 10% or a 5% response level, because we're being asked to extrapolate all the way down to a risk of 1 in a million. So I took a look at what EPA did there in terms of modeling and discovered that they took their standard approach. They fit a class of a different series of models, the linearized multi-stage model, the Weibull model, log logistic model, and some others, and found that none of the ones that are usually used fit the data at all. There was a significant lack of fit, and that in part comes from the fact that all of the exposure levels that are non-zero show a very high incidence and an almost plateau. And that's not a shape, a plateau, and then back down to the controls that those models are capable of describing very effectively. But the log logistic model can do that. It can look like a step if you want. And it did fit, but that's not a good enough reason in my mind to say this is a solid dose response evaluation approach. So I have a concern there. And EPA, to be honest, did admit that there is an issue because the models aren't consistent with one another. In fact, they're way off from each other. So that's a problem. I don't dispute the slope factor that comes out of it, 0.1 per milligram per kilogram per day. But I do have questions about how much useful information can be extracted from this study that was used to inform us about what the risks might be down at 1 in a million exposure levels. So that's that. And what I would expect to happen, I don't doubt that the state has done its homework in terms of utilizing the cancer slope factor correctly. But I think there is language in the report that indicates that there isn't, that the exposure levels that are seen for 1,4-dioxane in North Carolina, while they're higher than they are in other states, are still protective of people, because all of the margin of exposure calculations were above 10,000, including the one based on the cancer slope factor. And I don't think that's the case, but I don't exactly know how that worked out. So I would like to see, number one, a correction of the table 3 in this legislative report, to put the cancer slope factor in a different place in the table and to bring down a 1 in a million health-based criterion, an exposure level in milligrams per kilogram per day, a human equivalent. And that would solve the problem of consistency across the different approaches in terms of units. It would also show that the carcinogenicity endpoint is by far the most sensitive of the endpoints that have been looked at and produces the lowest water quality standard of any of these approaches. And there might be some additional verbiage that could be added to the document in terms of how EPA's cancer slope factor was derived, and some of the questions that I've just raised about whether or not this is an appropriate data set, because it really doesn't demonstrate dose response except to say there's a treatment related effect. It's very high, but it doesn't tell you anything about the shape of the curve as you move down below 50% response. And also to call attention to the fact that the typical models that are used to do this, get down to a 1 in a million, don't do a good job of describing the data at all. So it raises the question of whether or not one should be doing dose response modeling like this. It might be simpler to just assume that all of the animals at the low dose that's non-zero got the tumor. So you'd have 100% incidence instead of the 60% incidence I was talking about, and use that to calculate a 1 in a million risk level. It wouldn't be much different than at most a factor of 2 from the number that's being used now. So that's where I think I should stop and
Yeah, let me
gauge.
So when you were summing up, and again, I appreciate all the technical concerns. One is units.
Yep.
And as I indicated to board members yesterday in an email, I think that one's easily dealt with. It's kind of a right-wrong thing, but that's my opinion. I heard you say you didn't quibble with the cancer slope factor, but you would suggest additional verbiage on its derivation and the study that was used and the modeling and the discrepancies in the models.
Yeah, some verbiage about the limitations of the number that comes out.
But just so I'm clear, where would you want to see that? Because the state's report is final, so you would want that to be in the board's summation of whether or not the state's approach is scientifically reasonable?
I don't know where you should put it.
Do you feel like it affects, is it related to the charge on whether or not the document is scientifically
Yeah,
reasonable?
to me personally, it does raise that question.
Okay.
Is it scientifically reasonable?
And
Those are limitations of the approach that EPA took that were to some extent acknowledged in that document, but not acknowledged in the report.
Mhm.
So one can come away from reading the state report feeling that EPA did its job with the assessment. North Carolina did its job with the exposure characterization, and you put the two together using the standard approaches and you come up with a reasonable number.
Mhm.
And maybe that's not true.
Mhm.
I would be concerned about it. It's more uncertain than I would have expected.
Yeah, and just for clarity, and I'm just trying to keep it simple so we can walk through them methodically. In addition to units, if there's not a quibble with the cancer slope factor that arises, if the state's intention was to use EPA's number rather than do a systematic review of all the data and come up with their own number, and they cite EPA that did do in the EPA IRIS full document as opposed to the summary, there is a lot about the different models. Let's see that you've printed it out. If their intention was to adopt it, are you saying that it's insufficient to have referenced that document where it explains that the models had their limitations and what they did as a workaround for the models? You feel like that needed to be restated?
I think it should be restated. I don't think that EPA actually did a job as adequate as I would want to see in terms of a discussion of the limitations of this data set for dose response extrapolation.
Okay, I think I've got it for now. And I will, since we didn't have anything else on a technical issue, before we move back to revisit the comments on the board's overall summary, I'm going to open it up for any discussion. First, questions for Tom on his two issues, and then we'll see where we are in terms of having reached a consensus. So let's focus on this two technical issues. The first is the units. Is there any additional discussion about the units of the table with a cancer slope factor being different than a reference dose, but then being included in the same line? John?
I may be a little bit confused about your concern. The oral slope factor is 1 × 10⁻⁻1 per milligram / kilogram per day. That's what's in the IRIS assessment. Are you saying that's not correct?
No, that's not what's in the state's table.
In the state report, table 3, it is described as 0.1 milligrams per kilogram per day. No per.
No per.
It's described as an exposure level.
There's no to the -1 or per. It's not correct.
Table 3.
So the consequence is what?
Well, it's not a cancer slope factor. It doesn't have the units of a cancer slope factor in table 3.
So it's a typo is what you're saying.
That's how I view
It
it.
sounds to me like what you're saying is there may be a typo there.
Well, there is a typo, yes.
Okay.
I viewed it as that way because there's a section later in the document that employs the cancer slope factor
To develop.
to do the math, to derive the drinking water value at a 1 in a million risk, which ends up with the same number that EPA did because it used the same input parameters. So the units are correct in the math, the equation, or you wouldn't have been able to cancel the units out. But in the table, the word per is missing.
So it sounds like a typo is what you're saying.
Yeah. I actually brought this up in April.
So it may well be that given the charge, we could say that the approach is scientifically reasonable and there may be a typo related to this value in the table. To me, that seems to be an easy fix.
Well, except that I'm not so sure that it's scientifically reasonable.
Well, that's a different question.
Is that a separate issue?
That's a
Is that
separate
issue
issue.
number 2?
Yes.
Okay, but
Okay.
in
So-
terms of like clarity on the units, can we just focus on that one for a second and then we
Yeah.
can move on to the other one?
Although I would have preferred to see that row of the table include nothing but exposure levels to avoid confusion. If you put the per in, it would be correct to say that the cancer slope factor is 0.1 per milligram per kilogram per day.
Since it's the only one that has a cancer slope factor, it would need to have like a blank in the other lines and then a line below it that says cancer slope factor and then blanks. But you could actually include a line at the very bottom, which is all the drinking water values that would have been derived from those too, which is
Well,
ultimately, I
yeah.
think, what's used in screening.
Yeah, actually, you could take the 1 in a million risk probability and do the calculation of what the exposure level is for that. Put that in that.
That'd be a whole
place.
new row at the bottom.
Huh?
It'd be
No.
like as a whole new
Leave it at the
row.
leave it as the health-based criterion,
Mhm.
because that is what this report says. It's a health-based criterion. It's not a slope factor.
Any other comments on the units part before we move on to the,
I mean, that's a simple fix. That's just a typo. That's what I would characterize that as.
yeah, and again, the math part is in the, ultimately, EPA and the state are using the same number for 1 in a
Correct.
million
That's right.
cancer risks.
Correct.
That's right.
Which is what leads me to believe that it's a units issue as opposed to anything else to correct.
Yeah.
So we good on that?
We're good on that part.
All right.
Okay. I think we can add a line to the summary that notes that issue. And I think, it could be that, well, we'll work on phrasing of it, but it can be something related to,
An omission of the word per.
but it's important in a table
mean the
because
table can't
tables
be
usually,
changed?
the tables have, people read tables for simplicity. And in this case, it's overly simplistic.
So the table cannot be changed at this point.
Well, it's a final document, but in terms of whether or not, I don't know, I guess I would defer to the agencies about maybe an online version of it, maybe could be changed. I don't know. But our feedback can include the notation that in addition to the review of scientific reasonableness, this is noted for clarity. And one of the issues that we walked through in April about whether a document was scientifically reasonable, in addition to the questions that I'd read about methodology, data, assumptions, was clarity.
Right.
So, and I didn't, but I intentionally expanded the sideboards at the April meeting to say, although we're being asked about scientific reasonableness, folks should feel free to comment on any aspect of it they think could be helpful to the state. So for clarity, we can bring that up. All right. So that's good for issue 1 on units. Now the issue is the choice of the study that was used for the cancer slope factor. Or maybe that's too narrow of a way to say it because it was, or too broad because it wasn't the choice of study. It was the particular cohort, which was the female mice in a study that included males and females of mice and rats and a variety of endpoints. So it's the female mouse liver adenoma and carcinoma data and the modeling that was used to derive a cancer slope factor from it.
So is your issue related to the modeling? It sounds like you were saying the modeling is the shape of the dose response, or is it you're questioning the response of males and females, rats and mice and multiple tumor types? I'm not sure exactly what your
Well,
concern
these are all
is.
females. Number one, they're all female mice. The other data sets yield cancer slope factors that are smaller than the one that comes from this data set. That's EPA's choice, rationale for choosing this one. It yielded the highest cancer slope factor. And I mean, that's their policy typically, so I'm not arguing with that. So that's the data set. But the data set in terms of its dose response information, to my view, is very limited because all of the treated groups show very high incidences of tumor and basically a plateau. If you were to do a test of trend without including the control animals, you would probably not get a significant trend test.
Well, I guess this was really addressed and dealt with back in the original analysis in 2010, and then again by the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention at EPA in 2020, where they looked at the dose response modeling. And again, it went through extensive review within different federal agencies as well as external peer review. So this is not new, this concern. And this is, as we know in science, there oftentimes are uncertainties with that. And so EPA selected to do certain benchmark dose modeling with that data set that we're talking about here. And again, included very specifically information from the benchmark dose technical guidance document about the selection of the benchmark response that should be used. And so that's all documented. So I'm not really sure you're reiterating issues that have already been dealt with extensively by other groups, including large peer review groups. So I don't know that that addresses the issue of is report scientifically reasonable. So what are you asking us to do is to recapture what has already been dealt with extensively by other groups? Or just you're expressing your concern that has been expressed by others during the many reviews that have occurred on these documents?
Well, I'm not privy to that at this point, and I don't know that I have ever been privy to what
It's all,
went
the-
on
it's all
there.
it's all on the record for the IRIS assessments.
Yeah, I'd have to do a lot of digging to find that, right?
Right.
But my concern is that when you don't have clear evidence of a dose response, when you have basically a saturated dose response at all of the treatment group levels, that is essentially non-informative about what the shape of the curve might be down near 1 in a million risk or anywhere else farther down on the curve than 1% or 10%. That's why EPA selected a benchmark dose level of 50% incidence as the point of departure. 50% incidence, 1 out of 2.
That's
Instead
because
of the
they
BMD-10.
selected that because that was closer to the observable data than the 10% level. That's why that was selected, which is very consistent with the guidance for benchmark dose modeling. That's exactly right. I mean, you're right. It shows a higher level because that was consistent with the observable data.
That doesn't mean it's a good reason to do that when you're trying to get down to a much lower level of 1 in a million risk, is what I'm saying. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Elena, and then we'll see if anybody on the phone has questions for Tom or comments on the issue.
I think what I'm hearing, putting it very simply for that second concern, it seems basically that I think what you're saying, Tom, is that there's more uncertainty in this number than the report really captures. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that could certainly be captured in the board's summary if it was deemed appropriate. Because I mean, we're not going to redo this. It's a final report, but we can characterize or indicate there's a degree of uncertainty. I mean, we can better characterize perhaps the degree of uncertainty in this, but there's always uncertainty in any of this work. So it's just, that's me trying to simplify it.
Thank you. That helps, I think. Let's go to folks on the phone. Gina, Jamie, or, well, I'm going to call on Jamie. Her hand is raised. I'm sorry, I just saw that.
Thanks, Tom. And just for the record, I will be here throughout the entire meeting. I just had to switch from my phone to my office computer.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to put John on the spot a little bit, and just to help us all refresh our memories about the level of internal and external peer review in IRIS risk assessments, and really with the ease with which people can find some of those comments. John, could you remind us of how many levels of review these IRIS assessments go through, both internally and externally?
Thanks for the question, Jamie. So again, just to be about the role that I had, I was the division director of the group that developed this IRIS assessment on 1,4-dioxane. And so I was responsible for the staff developing a document and going through a review by the IRIS team, which is basically scientists across the EPA. And then it went through a federal agency review, which included other agencies, NIH, ATSDR, Department of Energy, other federal agencies that had interest in the chemical, all reviewed and provided comments on it as well. And then that was sort of managed by the White House Office of Management and Budget. And then it went through an external peer review process. This is, again, both the 2010 and the 2013 documents. External peer review, and then the final document, again, went through the same review process again. It's a very extensive review process for IRIS assessments where, again, it was reviewed internally to EPA scientists, and then other agencies were given an opportunity to comment on the final document. And all of that was, a very extensive process. That's the IRIS document. Again, there was another review, at least one other review, by the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, where their review process is not quite as extensive, but an important part of that is they go through an external peer review panel of experts that are identified and organized and managed by a contractor. The IRIS assessments are all the same way. It's managed by a contractor independent of EPA in terms of the selection of reviewers and the process. That, again, it was in 2020 document, and that was focused really on the mode of action and trying to understand if there was basically a cytotoxicity-based mode of action rather than an unknown or genotoxic or other types of mode of action. That occurred around to finish the document in 2020. It probably happened starting in 2018 to 2019. I'm not exactly sure of the timing of that. Is that what you're looking for, Jamie?
To a degree, but then aren't IRIS risk reviews sent out to selected external reviewers who also provide scientific feedback, criticism, et cetera?
Yes, that's what I was referring to when I said the peer review, the external peer review is scientists that's all managed by a contractor, and they select experts in a variety of ranges of expertise to do the external peer review. Yeah, so there's an external peer review process always.
So like a manuscript that could get published in a journal, there could be mistakes that slip by, but the process is fairly rigorous, and we could argue even more rigorous in terms of review than a manuscript that could get published.
Yeah, we've made that exact argument that it is more extensive than manuscripts.
Is there feedback or questions, Jamie, before I move on to others on the phone?
I'm finished.
Gotcha. Thank you. Gina or David, any questions for Tom regarding his perspective on this or observations on the issue if you adequately understand it based on the discussion so far?
This is David, none for me. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Gina. No questions or comments.
Anybody else in the room? So
Can I ask you just one question to get a feeling for where you might be coming from? Do you feel as confident with this dose response assessment and the data set as you would with one that the linearized multi-stage model fit more than adequately and didn't require extrapolations from such high response levels?
I mean,
are you as comfortable with this?
It's obvious that everybody would like to have, 16 dose response measures. And of course,
just 4 doses.
I mean, it's not a fair question because that's not what we're asked of here. We're asked of, is this assessment, given its development, its review, its characterization of the science and the uncertainty in the science, is it scientifically reasonable? And that's the question. I'm not going to answer your question because I don't think it's a reasonable question. Am I more or less comfortable with this versus something else?
So you
do you like apples or peaches? I don't, what does that matter?
Is it any less scientifically reasonable than the perfect one? Or just one where all the dose response models fit adequately? I mean, that's got to raise questions, doesn't it?
As part of the development, the experts in benchmark dose modeling were actually employed. The people who wrote the guidance document were the ones doing the modeling here. And it went through external peer review, which included experts in benchmark dose modeling. So,
well, I mean, I have a lot less faith in these empirical models. The multi-stage model at least has some basis in biology in terms of a sequence of irreversible steps that have to occur before you end up with an observable tumor in an animal that's exposed to a chemical for a lifetime. That's credible. The other models that are used do not have that same plausibility. And here we have a case where the linearized multi-stage model could not fit the data, provided an inadequate fit, even at the 10% level of adequacy. So that gives me pause. And I would like to see some of that uncertainty expressed in the North Carolina document when it makes reference to this cancer slope factor. I'm not saying they shouldn't use it, but to me, that raises credibility questions.
Well, I guess going back,
reasonableness questions. It might not be reasonable.
again, I think this is the judgment we all have to make and we'll
Okay.
draw a conclusion about. But I think that the report itself, the state report, is what it is. And maybe there's a typo, but is it scientifically reasonable? I think each of us has to make our own judgment about that. And I can hear you're questioning that. You know, if we draw a vote, then that's how we would decide what we're doing as a board.
All right.
Yeah, I'm still looking for any questions on, the technical foundation. If somebody, so just a couple of things in case they're helpful, and then I'll get to a question that Jamie has. Remember that the board, agreed with encouraging the state to look at existing synoptic reviews of others, given the time constraints that they were under to derive a human health-based risk assessment for the legislature. So there wasn't, the ability to go back and re-examine all the individual data points. Given that, and the charge about whether or not the states, what the states, is the state's reports reasonable? If they cited EPA's assessment, and EPA's assessment has probably well over 50 of its 500 pages are related to this topic, this exact topic. Do you think it's unreasonable?
Do I think what's unreasonable?
That the state's report, is it scientifically unreasonable, given that they cited the source for the hazard information, and that source has 1/10 of its content aimed at this study, those data, multiple printouts of all the model fits, the workaround that they did, and the rationale for why, that it was a likely human carcinogen, and they were looking at the most protective carcinogenic value that they could pull out of it.
I guess, if EPA was that thorough in terms of going after this stuff, some of that ought to be reflected in this document, or it isn't conveyed. The uncertainty that Elena alluded to isn't conveyed by the North Carolina report.
Mhm.
I
Okay,
think it should be.
all right. Jamie?
Thanks, Tom. And this may have already been answered, but I think the question that we also have to consider is that, is this value, even considering its uncertainties and potential confounders, is it appropriately, are the values that arise from the use of this study appropriately protective of public health, considering exposures to 1,4-dioxane? And I think we've kind of addressed that.
So say it again. You say we've kind of addressed it, meaning what? How did
Meaning,
you?
I think because the state submitted this report, I think I get the impression that the board agrees that that moving forward, the value that's been proposed will be protective of human health. So does the uncertainty associated with this particular study negate that the public will be protected from 1,4-dioxane in drinking water?
Oh, I got you. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, it's an important point. I was looking back at what we did with Gen X when we were asked to summarize the data as opposed to review somebody else's summary of the data. And we did benchmark dose modeling on all statistically significant endpoints from the available studies. And we came up with a range of, in that case, reference doses because it was not considered to be carcinogenic. At least that's not the approach that we took. And they spanned several orders of magnitude. And then we had to decide, which one to use when there was a bunch of them in front of us. In this case, there'll be many, many, many more endpoints like that to choose from because of the number of studies and the additional number of endpoints that were done. So the point about, could somebody else look at the data a different way when there's this much data? Absolutely. But would they have derived a number that was substantially different? Perhaps not. Perhaps not.
That's part of the uncertainty.
To the microphone, please.
Sorry, and that's part of the uncertainty.
So is there any we were asked in particular, let's see, this might help to recall the particular granularity that got us to that scientifically reasonable charge. D is interested in the SAB's feedback on whether the 2024 product is scientifically sound and whether the cancer slope factor used in the hazard evaluation section and its derivation are appropriate. So there's a fairly specific place in there where we're called to speak to that. And that would be a place to, if you think about some of the things that we've done in the past that had a lot of data, like hexavalent chromium. We worked for months on trying to get to a consensus on that, and there was a difference of opinion that we captured in the board's feedback to both explain what the difference was and the way that the board handled it. If we can struggle with this as a technical issue and come up with a consensus statement that that's the right number, that could have a utility. It also has utility just to point out here where there's disagreement and provide language around that. Why? Is there anything that anybody has heard that would move them toward, oh, I understand more now about what the concern is and agree or disagree with that as a number? Or whether or not, so no more discussions of the technical issues?
I don't think so.
Anybody on the phone? Then I guess I'm open to a suggestion about whether or not, about how to deal with this. We don't have a timeline definitively to provide our recommendations. There is a new issue on the table now. Does anybody have suggested phrasing for how to capture that in a summary statement? I think Elena had a go at it.
I think we should reference I would have done it in the original report. I think we did. But I would just say the uncertainty surrounding the use of this modeling is discussed, and just reference the original source. I know we don't usually do that in a high-level summary statement, but I do think that is a reasonable approach. Just like I think that what was done is scientifically defensible and reasonable as it stands in terms of the numerical, just perhaps acknowledgement of the uncertainty.
So it sounds like what we have in the board for the draft, I'm looking at here, that you sent around, perhaps we could add a brief paragraph, couple sentences to kind of capture this.
Yeah, to folks
Is that what
that
you're
you can
thinking?
craft that on the fly to make continued progress. If we're not suggesting that it's unreasonable, we're suggesting that we're calling attention to the uncertainty in the IRIS document for its continued use. Something like the board calls attention to the cancer slope factor derivation discussion from the IRIS 2003 document and the associated uncertainties around the use of the female mouse data from Cano et al. 2009. I don't know that John's point is that that's dealt with extensively. Your point is that it wasn't referenced except for by reference. Would something like that draws people's attention to that discussion?
To it, that's for sure.
But if we were to say, as one of our other findings or recommendations, that the board calls attention to the discussion of the cancer slope factor in the referenced EPA 2013 document for additional attention on the level of certainty or uncertainty around that, something to that effect.
Well, I'll look at it.
Well, do you have time to help craft it? Since it's your concern?
I'm gonna have to leave by 1.
Well, we could probably do it I think we're getting close. If you don't think, that it's, I heard you say, that you don't disagree with the use of the cancer slope factor, including this actual number that came out of it. So I do think it's more language than anything else.
Yeah.
What's next on the agenda, Franny?
There is the fish and water data presentation, the PFAS rulemaking update from the groundwater and public water groups, and then the Comores toxicity study update.
Yeah. You guys okay with calling an audible and take a break until a quarter after? At which point we could put some language up on the screen and
Sure.
see if people are okay with that.
I'd like to get it
Break
done.
until 12:15 or 1?
No, quarter after 12.
Okay.
Meaning that I think if we're looking to craft a sentence, I
fine.
think I could craft a sentence if
Yeah.
everybody wasn't,
That's fine.
waiting to see it.
Why don't we do that? I think it'd be really good to do it on the spot.
And if we can,
If you can, yeah.
at least it'll be a start. And I think that would serve the agencies better.
So Tom, you're talking about crafting a sentence quickly and very well, I'm sure, given your skills, that would be added to the board summary now. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it would be added to the board summary, and I don't
Okay.
think it allows us to move to a vote because there's people that aren't here today who haven't had a chance to see it. It's a substantial revision. But what it might do while we're together is avoid a bunch of emails back and forth if we can get close. And I think it serves the agencies well to hear from the board whether or not, we're talking about language and we could relatively quickly come up with the right language, or where are the rubs?
Yeah. So the oral report from Iris was 2010, the inhalation was 2013, just to be clear, because you were referring to 2003, I think, just now.
2013 is the document that I've had up, and it's the 540-page doc. But we can,
By incorporation, it brings in the 2010. The 2010 was oral, 2013 added the inhalation, but by extension, it was one big document. That's fine.
all right.
Okay, so that all that discussion of dose response evaluation doesn't pertain to the oral part, right?
It does.
Just
No, it
incorporated?
does.
No, it
It
does.
does.
Oh, it was.
Oh, it does.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
It's there.
It most definitely does.
I'll try to capture that in this so that it's actually pointing to the reference.
Yeah.
Instead of just Cano at all.
That's fine.
All right, please come back in about 7 minutes at a quarter after, and we'll see how much progress we can make on this before lunch break. So it'll be a foundation for all the additional comments, but it'll be on the screen shortly. And will people on the WebEx be able to see it?
They should be able to.
Yes. There it is. Thank you. Thank you guys.
Okay, this is bigger. Okay, let me just leave it like that.
I think you need to roll up to what the actual time. That's edited a little bit, the history of it for part.
This one. Has it changed since then? This is the most recent draft that I
I'm looking
have.
at it here. First paragraph's the same. Oh,
This one. Sorry, there's a delay between the two screens.
I think it's the board's response part that we want.
Okay.
you get the email?
I haven't looked.
I sent you
there a
an
new one?
email with the language.
Oh, okay.
Oh. You've edited this as well, is that right?
I have not edited that.
Oh. It's different than the version that I was just looking at.
Don't look at that.
Not to look
Look at the email that I sent. That's all we're talking about.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll end the suspense and I'll read it while Franny finds it, so you can hear what it sounds like, and then you can see it and we can maybe edit it online. If we can, great. If we can't, we'll just maybe send a revised version out and see how close we can get. So I heard this, in the hazard assessment portion of their risk assessment, the state used US EPA IRIS's assessment for the oral cancer slope factor. The US EPA IRIS document, which I cite, not the summary of, but the full version of. What you showed me is the summary. The full version is 500 pages long.
I understand.
More than 50 of which are on this issue. The EPA IRIS document with the hot link has extensive documentation on the study, endpoints, model filling, and uncertainty around this cancer slope factor. The board calls attention to that discussion moving forward, but they do not question the state's use of that cancer slope factor. And it very much said draft when I sent it, so.
Actually, extensive documentation on actually many studies. But it was the study selected for the cancer slope factor that this is referring to only.
But there's much more extensive documentation on this study because of this issue.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's the one that drives it. I mean, any of them that drive it would get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But there's an entire appendix in that document of the data tables from the study and why they chose the mouse instead of the rat and the females instead of the males. And the 3 different ways that it had been reported in the past. That same study was reported as a scientific proceedings, as a report, and then as a publication, peer-reviewed publication. They explain how the adenomas and carcinomas were re-reviewed through time to put them in proper categories, given changes in what a pathologist, might call one or the other. And there may be some typos in there because my screen was really small when I was. So let's hear from Tom first because he raised the concern. Again, our charge is whether the state's document is scientifically adequate. I heard you say you didn't quibble with the use of this particular cancer slope factor, but you wanted additional attention called to the discussion around its uncertainty. Would this do it?
Maybe if you put a qualifier on extensive, like unusually extensive.
I couldn't say that it was unusually extensive because I think any study that drives something significant is going to get its own appendix. I mean, if somebody gave us a ton of data on, as an aquatic toxicologist, mercury in birds, ultimately you'd say, I'm going to take this study over the hundreds of studies of mercuries in birds. But now I'm kind of obligated to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly about that one particular study. So I can't say that, but I'm not saying that it's incorrect. But it wouldn't surprise me that for any endpoint that becomes the driver, that the discussion is extensive in defense of it.
Well, you seem surprised that 50 of the 500 pages were devoted to this.
I'm not surprised by it at all.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
surprised that
I
we're
misunderstood.
saying if it was cited by the state, that we think that we have more to offer than that extensive flagging of this exact same issue. Like if the state had not given a citation for this document as the source of it, then I would say, well, maybe we've unearthed something new, but this isn't new. But I heard you saying it wasn't flagged enough. And so
I don't consider the 1,4-dioxane assessment typical. It's not representative. It's different. And this doesn't convey that quite.
This is Jamie. I have a question on that comment. What do you mean it's not typical or representative of all iris assessments for all chemicals? I don't understand the question.
Can you name another assessment in which all of the treated groups had greater than 50% incidence of the tumor in question? Can you name
Well, I
one
think
other?
that there are many iris assessments. So I don't know if any of us have gone through every assessment to determine the specific data of a cancer slope factor. I mean,
So
I
the
guess
answer-
during lunch
the
I
answer
could
is-
go through some.
Your answer is no, you don't, you're not aware of one. Another one.
No, that's not my answer, Tom. My answer is I haven't gone through the data, so I don't have sufficient evidence to answer the question at this time. But if you give us time to go through those assessments substantially, we may find something like that. I don't think
John?
you have gone through all the assessments in detail to note whether or not this is unusual. I'm not trying to be combative.
I've gone through a lot of them, and my feeling, my experience has been that this is unusual. Oh, if your experience is different from that, is it or not?
I would have to kind of agree with Jamie at some levels that what is typical is kind of in the eyes of the beholder because they're all pretty unique in their own way. What they're consistent in is following the guidelines for assessment, including the many different guidelines that exist, whether it's for cancer or modeling or different endpoint guidelines. And so there's a level of consistency there that makes them similar in that fashion as the basis, but they're all kind of unique because the data sets are all unique. Can I say, is there another one that they used 50%? I can't say that, but I think there have been ones that are unusual. Shape dose response is not unusual in some ways. So I don't know that the word, were you proposing to put in the word not typical or something?
No, just unusually extensive documentation. Maybe not.
No,
unusually.
I don't know that's really the case.
Okay, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not.
I might ask the question is that, again, I just try to remember, is this in the hazard assessment portion or is it in the dose response portion?
Dose response.
You in the first few words they say hazard, it should be dose response portion, right?
Should be the dose response portion.
Right.
I guess I'm trying to capture that Tom's technical feedback, which we value. I mean, the only reason for having a board of that has expertise is to have people with expertise to say, well, I saw the way other people did it, and that's awesome. I saw the way other people did it, and it gives me pause. I wouldn't have any trouble saying yes or no on a stack of data associated with aquatic toxicology either. That's not the way I would have done it, but it's still reasonable. But that's not the way that I would have done it. And it's not reasonable. In fact, I think it's incorrect. And that's what I think our charge is not whether there's a different way to look at the data. It's whether what the state did was unreasonable. And I guess I haven't heard you say that it's unreasonable. It just needed to be appropriately characterized about the level of uncertainty around that endpoint. And that's what I'm trying to capture. Because if we continue to say that the state's use of this was reasonable, then I think the summary document, it's an editing thing. If you think that it's unreasonable, then I think we have to drop back a little bit and write a different summary document. But we have time for just a couple more minutes on this while we have you, because otherwise we're going to have to do it by email. But we dealt with the units issue. The last sentence is what I heard you say, that you didn't disagree with this particular cancer slope factor. It is cited in the document as this is the source, and the document describes the uncertainty. We're just asking the state to be aware of the uncertainty around it. We could add some things for the public and the agencies in case it's helpful, but does the board agree or disagree with the EPA and ITDR classification of this compound as a likely human carcinogen? And that the IRIS document is replete with carcinogenic endpoints in a variety of species and a variety of tissues, and that they chose this one because ultimately you do need to come up with one to model and derive a
This is
factor.
okay. Barely, but it's okay.
Barely.
I'll live with it.
If
I'm thinking that if I had it to do, I would do it different. That's for sure.
you would do this characterization of the issue differently, or you would do the derivation of the cancer slope factor differently?
I would say that in addition to doing the calculation, I would say alternatively, one could avoid doing a dose response assessment altogether. Or one could simply assume that there was 100% incidence at the lowest dose and draw the straight line down from there. And you wouldn't be much worse than this in terms of the severity of the response at the magnitude of the dose associated with the 1 in a million risk, less than a factor of 2 apart.
Yeah.
So what has all this fussing done for us? All the modeling, all the model fitting, the use of a model that has no biological basis at all. And all the rest, all of these. Put it in the pot and stir it up, kind of stuff.
Yeah. In EPA's
It's got
document,
us nothing.
in EPA's describing the uncertainty, they point out that the way to, a way to resolve the uncertainty for the low dose modeling from this would be to do a new experiment with lower doses. And, that strain of mice.
That would be useful.
Yeah.
That would be useful.
It does take time. So anyway, I'm going to propose that we incorporate this into the document, send it back out. It becomes an agenda item for the next meeting, or if the state needs it sooner, some between meeting work. Give people a chance to reflect on it. I guess I should ask, although I asked Tom whether it's captured his concern, is there anybody that adding this gives them pause? I hear Elena's okay with it, John's okay with it, Viney's okay with it. Everybody on the phone, would you be okay with this being an addition? It doesn't preclude the opportunity to vote yes or no on it later. It's just a chance to hear about it before we move on. So David, Gina, and Jamie, would an addition like this be okay with you?
This is Jamie. I'm okay with that. I think if I was going to make one edit to it, I would add after the extensive documentation on the study, maybe say extensive documentation on the primary study and supporting studies, but otherwise.
Okay, yeah, we'll leave some time for those edits back and forth, both from any member on the board. I think in the thing that I sent y'all yesterday to tee this up, I was even more specific. I was like, the use of the female mouse portion of the Cano 2009 study, because that's what all this is about. So we'll fold that in. We'll redistribute it. I will encourage everyone to read the EPA summary of that uncertainties, not the condensed version and the summary, but the long version. See if that captures the full weight of the concerns and if there's something different, more granular that we would want to add. And then I'll just close by saying, just trying to get for my own clarity, if this was added into the summary, would you be able to vote on the charge question, which is the state's document scientifically adequate? Because that's what this is, a workaround is to try to get to consensus. We never got the consensus on hexavalent chromium, so the thing that we voted on said one member saw it differently and explained that difference. But are we close to consensus, or would we be setting it up more for a divergence?
No, I think we're close.
All right. All right, well, good work. I will ask the folks from the state whether they think we should break for lunch or move on to the next agenda topic. I don't know how long it's going to take.
I would suggest we break for lunch. And then we can reconvene. I'm giving most of the presentations, so I can speed
Are
them
you
along
giving all
if
of
we
them?
need to.
For
Not
the
all
one
of them.
one that we're just doing, would a delay work? Is it going to be okay? We're not going to bump anybody else off
No.
their availability. All right. Seem reasonable? So we'll come back. Is it, should we cut that a little bit short and come back at, what'd you say, 1:15?
Maybe 1:15?
1:15. All right, for folks on the phone, we're going to break until 1:15. You can stay on, but if you stay on, you might want to mute microphones. And for those in the room, please be back at 1:15. Thanks, folks. Which we made pretty good progress on. I think we're still on track to have a consensus statement at the end. And one that will in fact end up saying that the board finds the state's risk assessment scientifically reasonable with just a little bit more granularity on the effects assessment portion. Here we are going to change the order, though, of the presentations, and that we'll first hear from Bridget Shelton on the PFAS rulemaking status. So, Bridget, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Great. Bridget Shelton with the Division of Water Resources. So just a quick update on the groundwater quality standards PFAS rulemaking status. So as a reminder, the Environmental Management Commission, or the EMC, is our rulemaking body. They have the authority to adopt groundwater standards under the state rule 15A NCAC 02L 0202. So materials for meetings where this item was presented at the EMC are available on their website on the link here if you're interested. And then we must follow the requirements and procedures in the Administrative Procedures Act for rulemaking, which includes a public notice, public comment period, public hearing, and the preparation of a fiscal note. So here are the proposed groundwater standards for a subset of PFAS. So the EMC approved to move forward with proposed standards for 3 compounds. So that's PFOS, PFOA, and Gen X. We use the procedures and calculations in the 02L 0202 rule to derive groundwater standards for these compounds. So in this table, I've included the reference that we used in the standards derivation and the toxicity benchmarks and values available for each compound, with the bolded value indicating what was used in the standards development as that led to the lowest level to be the most protective of human health. So the proposed standards are listed here on the right-hand column. Just to note here again for PFOS and PFOA, the standard value is lower than the EPA's reported PQL, or practical quantitation limit, of 4 parts per trillion. So that is lower than what can be reliably detected at this time. So the 02L rule does have language to account for this. So if these standards become effective, the health-based value shown here would be what is listed in the rule, but the compliance level for PFOS and PFOA would be the PQL value. So when I last updated the board, we were in the middle of a public comment period. So that comment period concluded at the end of last December. We held 3 hearings across the state and had a number of registered attendees and speakers at each hearing, as you can see here. We had the most attendance at the hearing in Wilmington, with 56 registered attendees and 16 registered speakers. At the closing of the comment period, we received 576 individual written comments. So here's a brief summary of the comments that we received. These comments are summarized as well as staff responses are in the hearing officer's report of proceedings, which is available on the EMC's website. I'm also happy to share that with any members if they're interested. So as a general overview, the majority of the comments that we received were in support of the 3 proposed groundwater standards. We did receive comments that covered topics of similar concern that we grouped together in the report, including supporting standards for more PFAS compounds, comments on the EPA's national primary drinking water regulations for PFAS, comments concerning the implementation of the standards, and comments concerning the derivation of the standards and other health-based information. And again, that hearing officer's report will have more details on these comments as well as responses. So after reviewing the comments and responses, the 3 hearing officers from the EMC for this item did recommend that the proposed standards for PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X that went out to public notice and those values that I showed on a slide earlier be adopted by the EMC. So the EMC did vote to approve the hearing officer's report and voted to adopt the rule at their last meeting, which was September 2025. So the next step for this rulemaking process is to go before the Rules Review Commission, or their RRC, for their approval of the rule. So we have filed the rule and are hoping to be on their October meeting agenda. So the RRC will review the rule to make sure it is within the agency's authority, that it's written clearly and it's adhered to the rulemaking process. So if we receive approval from the RRC at their October meeting, this rule and these 3 standards will become effective on November 1st, 2025. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Bridget. Are there any questions from folks in the room? And then I'll open it up to folks on the phone. John?
That's very helpful. Thank you for laying it out like that. In terms of the comments that you received, that we're looking at the derivation of the values, were they questioning the way that the EPA had analyzed the data, or what were they actually speaking to?
Yeah, we received a number of comments. Some were concerning some of the uncertainties and limitations in the EPA values and their toxicity assessments.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else in the room? And any questions from Jamie or David or Gina?
This is David. I have none. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Are we now, Franny, going to move to back to the regular order?
There is a second part to the rulemaking
Okay.
topic, and so Kayla Cunningham is going to give the public water federal MCL update.
The MCL portion. I got you.
Kayla Holmes, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm Kayla Holmes. I'm the new PFAS and emerging contaminants team leader in the public water supply section. I'm going to give an overview of the language in the PFAS federal regulations as they stand currently, and then explain the changes that EPA is expected to make over the next year. All right, so this is all regarding the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation for 6 PFAS contaminants published to the Federal Register in April of last year. And the rule is proposed for adoption to the state rules and would be incorporated by reference, in the language that would be used is laid out in this slide. All right, so just an overview of the affected systems. All community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems that have their own source are affected. And in North Carolina, that amounts to over 1,900 systems. There's a breakdown by type in this table.
We don't just sum those up. That's
So the top row is the total number. The next two rows show you how many out of that total are community water systems and then non-transient. Then there's a breakdown by groundwater and surface water.
Thank you.
All right, so the rule currently includes 5 maximum contaminant levels. I've put a green box around the MCLs that are expected to remain after EPA's revisions are proposed and finalized if that is what ends up happening. The remaining MCLs for PFXS, HFPODA, PFNA, and then the hazard index MCL for mixtures of 2 or more of the compounds in that bottom row, those are all expected to be removed. And then the rule as it currently stands includes compliance determination based on a running annual average at each entry point. Okay, here's a summary of the rule requirements as they stand currently. So public water systems must conduct initial and ongoing compliance monitoring for the regulated PFAS compounds, which includes taking samples at all entry points to the distribution system, sampling during periods of representative operating conditions. They must implement solutions to reduce regulated PFAS in their drinking water if those levels exceed the MCLs, and they must inform the public of levels of regulated PFAS measured in their drinking water and if 1 or more MCLs are exceeded. Okay, these are the effective dates that are currently listed in the rule. Starting up at the top, as of June 25th, 2024, all samples submitted by public water systems must be analyzed by labs that are certified to meet certain analytical requirements. And this includes using methods of analysis that are approved by EPA. And then April 26th, 2027 is when a few things happen. This is when the results of initial monitoring are due to the state. And it's also the date at which compliance monitoring is set to begin. 2027 consumer confidence reports must include those initial monitoring results. And from April 2027 onward, systems must meet public notification requirements. Then this last date is subject to change based on EPA's current plans. So currently, April 26th, 2029 is the date at which systems must meet the MCL compliant. They must comply with the MCLs. But EPA plans to extend that date out to 2031. So there'd be a 2-year extension. Okay, so then on this slide, we have all of the proposed regulatory updates and some outreach efforts that EPA has stated in their announcement back in May, when they stated they're intending to revise the published PFAS regulations. So that top bullet point is the one we discussed. Potential removal of the individual MCLs for PFXS, PFNA, HFPODA, or GenX chemicals, and also the hazard index. And then the compliance deadline is expected to be pushed out to 2031. They also announced plans to establish a federal exemption framework, but no details were provided concerning what that would entail. So that information would be to come. They mentioned enhanced outreach for small and rural communities in an effort called PFAS Out, where EPA intends to connect with public water utilities that require capital improvements to provide technical assistance and resources for those utilities to address PFAS in their systems. They may establish effluent limitations guidelines or ELGs for PFAS. And these are intended to hold polluters accountable and reduce the amount of PFAS that's entering drinking water sources. We're expecting the proposed rule revision to come out this fall, with a finalized rule expected for publication in spring of next year. But until then, we are currently upholding the content of the rule as written. All right. Are there any questions?
Thank you for the update. There's a lot of news in there. Any questions from people on the board? John?
So if you go back one slide there.
Yes.
So the proposed rule will presumably explain why there's a reevaluation and possible rescinding of the regulations for Gen X and others. Do you have any idea what the rationale is for that?
Their announcement, in their words, they say this is intended to make sure that the legal process laid out in the Safe Drinking Water Act is followed accordingly. That was a part of the official statement.
That's interesting.
Yes, yes, it is.
Do you expect that the state might want to have comments on that when it comes out as a proposal? Because to go from fall of 2025 to spring 2026 is very, very fast for rulemaking. So would you anticipate the state would have a view particularly about Gen X?
I cannot say, but I would have to discuss with our team to make an official statement there, but
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any questions from folks on the phone? All right. Thank you, Kayla.
Thank you.
So Franny, are we now moving on to the back to the agenda?
Yes.
All right. So I think it's you who's up next. And we're going to get a presentation on the DEQ water and fish study from PFAS chemicals in the lower Cape Fear River, the saltwater component.
Yes. And so today I'm going to present the saltwater samples from the study that we have done in 22 and 23. And so I'll briefly take you through some of the previous stuff we looked at, but most of it today will be on the saltwater portion of the study. No? Okay. Okay. So just as a review, the project was designed because we know PFAS are persistent in many environments. North Carolina has a point source facility right on the Cape Fear River. And the Cape Fear River runs over 200 miles across the state and serves as a drinking water source for many North Carolinians. The goals of this study were to examine the extent of PFAS contamination and better understand its bioaccumulation in the aquatic environment, and also to collect fish tissue data that could be used for the development of consumption advisories if appropriate. This study spanned 2 years of sampling. So we did most of the sampling in June and August of 2022, where more than 200 fish were collected throughout the Cape Fear River. The saltwater fish were not presented publicly at that time because the proportion of fish that we caught from the lower Cape Fear was not as robust as the other locations. And so it was hard to make statistical statements about a site when you had one individual fish from a species. So fortunately, we have a biological assessment branch in our Division of Water Resources, and they were kind enough to spend 3 days on the river 2 falls ago. And they collected, over the course of 3 days, they caught more than 200 fish, but only retained 17 of them, which filled out my sampling set. So I'm very grateful to that group for doing that for us. We analyzed these fish fillets alongside water samples collected at the same time, according to the same method that we had used previously, which was the EPA 537.1 modified that includes the Camorra's compounds. This project was a huge effort and involved a number of different state level agencies and as well as divisions within DEQ. We worked with DHHS and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission to put this project together. We use the Wildlife Resource Commission to identify the most commonly consumed recreationally caught species in the region. And then we worked with our Division of Marine Fisheries and Water Resources to collect the samples, and the Division of Public Health at DHHS to ensure that we were collecting enough individuals and samples to be utilized for an advisory if that was appropriate. So this is a map that you may recall seeing before, but this is the map of the sampling locations. And we took the Cape Fear River south of Fayetteville and divided it into 20-kilometer sections. The freshwater data is from the top 7 sites along the river. This was all presented previously, and today we're going to talk about the fish and water that was collected at these bottom 3 sites from Wilmington to the mouth of the Atlantic Ocean. Because this is a different part of the river and a different aquatic environment, there are different species that were collected here than were collected in the freshwater portion of the river. And so the freshwater fish we collected were catfish, sunfish, and a largemouth bass. Striped bass, which move up and down the river between saline and fresh environments, were collected at all in both types of environments at a number of different sites. So they're the one fish that kind of spans the entire river. The saltwater species are listed here, and so these are black and red drum, sheep's head, Atlantic croaker, speckled trout, and southern flounder. Just to recap the freshwater data that we've looked at pretty extensively in the past, that PFOS was the most commonly and most highly concentrated detected PFAS in these fish tissues. And so if you look at the dot and line chart here, it goes across the page for the 5 different freshwater species. On the x-axis on the bottom are the freshwater sites and the reference site. And then on the y-axis, it is the mean PFAS concentration. So all PFAS are represented on these plots. The one you can really see is this dark blue line, and that is for PFOS. All of the other PFAS chemicals that were detected were in very low concentrations compared to the PFOS concentration, particularly in the sunfish and the bass. There were 2 Camorra's signature compounds that were detected in a few individuals, and these are one largemouth bass at site 5, and then there were a few sunfish at sites 8, 6, and 5 that had PFO5DA in them, and these are just 2 consent order compounds. What's important to note, and one of the biggest takeaways from this part of the study, was that there were no spatial trends identified with these compounds for fish tissue. This was not what I was expecting when we designed the study. I thought there would be a very clear spatial trend away from the facility, but that was just not what we observed. These few Camorra's compounds that did show up were really sporadic and seemingly random, and it was PFOS that we know bioaccumulates in fish, and that was what was observed in our species as well. So this is a fish and water study. And so what I'm showing you here is a plot of all of the site's water samples. And so I'll orient you before I talk about it. The colors on the bars are all represented by, or the PFAS are all represented by the different colors on the bars. And those are on the legend on the right side. The plot is organized by site number from mouth of the Atlantic Ocean at the bottom to the saltwater sites, all the way up to the reference site just south of Fayetteville. The total PFAS concentration is along the bottom. So this is total PFAS in all fish at the sites. This is total PFAS in the water collected at the sites. And so some sites had 1 water sample and some had 1 or 2. If there's 1 or 2, this is an average of those 3 totals. What's important to note here is that PFMOAA, which is that same compound that was identified in 1 freshwater fish, is consistently detected in surface water throughout the river. That is the very dark blue portion of the bar is PFMOAA. The highest concentration of PFMOAA proportionally was detected in these saltwater sites, which are further down the river than the facility. And so there's an interesting spatial pattern happening here that we have a few suggestions for why this may be happening. But it's really interesting to see that the PFMOAA compound, which is a very small a 3-carbon compound that is specifically identified with this facility is present throughout the river in different concentrations. Okay, I should have done a separate slide, but I'm gonna show you the saltwater data now. This is organized similarly. So the different species are in each of these plots. However, here the PFAS chemicals are listed on the y-axis and the bars run east and west. Along the bottom is just the mean concentration, and here the units are nanograms per gram, which is appropriate for a solid tissue sample. The colors in the bars here are a little different than the previous plot, but this dark blue bar here is PFOS. This is the mean PFOS concentration found in all of these species across these sites. The take home here again is that PFOS is detected in all of these fish samples at a greater concentration than all the other compounds. The 2 consent order compounds are indicated at the bottom with a little red asterisk. They were detected in a few fish at different sites, and so they are a slightly higher incidence than the freshwater fish, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, here it is, the Comores PFAS. So this is PFMOAA, that little 3-carbon compound again. And what we're looking at here in the 2 vertical plots are the Atlantic croaker and the sheep's head, 2 saltwater species. The PFAS chemicals are again on the vertical axis, and the mean concentration of the chemicals are on the Y, or on the X. What's interesting here is that we have PFMOAA, which is a very small compound, was detected in 5 of 17 individuals of the Atlantic croaker species. This is already many more than we detected it in the freshwater fish. There was a single largemouth bass that had this chemical detectable in its tissues. And there were many more largemouth bass throughout the freshwater portion of the river. So it was 1 of 36 individuals had this compound. And here there are fewer individuals, but the percentage is also higher. So it's 5 of 17 croaker had it. And then for the sheep's head, the average concentration is higher. The variation is also higher. But 6 of 10 sheep's head that were collected at these sites also had PFMOAA. And so there is a greater number of individuals at this part of the river that have it, and also a greater proportion of the individuals collected and sampled have it as well. The second Comores compound we detected was PFO5DA, which is the 3rd of a homologous series of these 3 compounds. This is one that has also been detected in human serum. Dr. Hoppen and Dr. Knappe have both reported this in humans and in the environment. This is one of the 3 homologous series that is able to be detected in biological tissues. Again, for the 2 vertical plots, these are 2 species. Instead of the croaker, this is the red drum on the left side of the plot, and then the sheep's head is on the right again. You'll notice the black bar, dark blue bar at the top is PFOS. That is the highest concentration of the PFAS chemicals observed in these fish. Down at the bottom is the PFO5DA mean concentrations. 7 of the 13 sampled red drum had this compound in detectable levels, and only 1 of the sheep's head that were collected had detectable levels of PFO5DA. By comparison, there were only 4 of the 34 red ear sunfish that were sampled in the freshwater portion of the river that had this compound detected. And so there are a greater number of individuals in this part of the river that had it. And a greater proportion of 1 species and then a single individual of the sheep's head. Recall from the previous slide, the sheep's head also had PFMOAA, and so that is that red bar right above the highlighted rectangle. That species had both compounds, whereas red drum only had 1 and the croaker also only had the PFMOAA. Okay, so that's just the general overview of this part of the river. I'm going to go through some site and species specific differences that I think are interesting and worth noting, because we didn't have many of those in the freshwater sections of the river. As far as total PFAS concentration, so all PFAS chemicals, the total concentration does decrease across sites, which is a trend I expected to see closer to the facility and away from the facility moving towards the ocean. However, this trend is fairly apparent here in this part of the river. And so when you look at the little plots, they're all the species. They're shorter plots because there's only 3 bars maximum for the 3 sampling sites. Again, the colors are indicative of the individual PFAS compounds. But you can see that in nearly all of these species-specific plots, that site 3, which is up by Wilmington, has a greater proportion of PFAS concentrations than sites 2 and or 1 if they're both present in the plots. There were some statistical differences here as well. And so when we looked at this same comparison in the freshwater tissue, we were not able to discern any statistically significant differences in the PFAS concentrations and the PFOS concentrations. There were some species-specific differences, but no site-specific differences. And here, there were site-specific differences for 3 of the species. So red drum, Atlantic croaker, and sheep's head all had statistically significant different PFOS concentrations in their tissues at the different sites that were sampled. It's interesting to note that these are the 3 species that also accumulate the Chemours compounds in their tissues. There were some evident differences in PFOS concentrations between the species at site 1. And so this is the site closest to the mouth of the Atlantic Ocean, the most marine or saline part of the river. Here, the box plots are left to right, the different species that were collected at this site. The PFOS concentration is on the vertical axis, and then the statistical differences are denoted by the little symbols. It's interesting to see that the croaker and the sheep's head on the far right have the lowest PFOS concentrations at that site, whereas those were 2 of the species that also accumulated the Chemours compounds. The other 3 species presented here, the southern flounder, red drum, and black drum, have some differences between them, but are mostly different from these other 2 species. And we saw something similar in the freshwater sites as a whole, where there were the largemouth bass and sunfish had greater proportions and concentrations of PFOS than the catfish did for the most part. So this is an interesting piece of this puzzle that we did not have in the freshwater sites. And this was another reason when we started to analyze this data in 2023, and we didn't have the number of individuals at each site, and there were fewer sites, so there were just less overall to compare. This was a suggested difference in the data, and we just didn't have the numbers to do any kind of statistical analysis. And so that was why we sent a whole branch of staff out into the river for a few days to collect more fish, because this data suggested a very evident difference than a pattern that we failed to see or did not see in the freshwater fish, and we wanted to be sure. And so more individuals were collected, and this relationship became even more statistically significant. One of the other comparisons we did with the freshwater fish to try to determine why these concentrations are what they are in the different species was comparing fork length to the PFOS concentration. And so fork length, for anyone that doesn't know, is the measurement that you take from the tip of a fish's nose to the little fork at the end of its tail. And this is the most accurate measure of body size, as the fine fins that can protrude off the end of a fish can get ripped in their environment. And so the fork piece is a very accurate measurement. You can see that there were a couple interesting differences here. When we did this analysis for the freshwater fish, there were some suggestive relationships, but nothing was statistically significant. What's interesting here is that there are. And so I have a lot of things over my legend here. But so the p-value symbols are indicated in the legend at the top right. The red drum, southern flounder, and sheep's head all had statistically significant relationships between their body size and their PFOS concentrations. This is a very common pattern in the environment in chemical accumulation and bioaccumulation. Generally, with body size, these concentrations increase as body size is usually a proxy of age and length of time in the environment. The speckled trout had an even more statistically significant relationship. They had a relationship at 0.1, or no, it was less significant. I'm sorry, it was 0.1. So it was suggestive of a statistically significant relationship, but it was not technically significant. The other two had no inkling of statistical significance, and that was more closely related and reflective of what we saw in the freshwater fish. Okay, so as a summary of the data that I just presented, PFMOAA, which is the 3-carbon Chemours compound, is detected in the surface water at all of our sites, freshwater and saltwater. PFOS is detected in all fish species at all sites. The consent order compounds, PFMOAA and PF05DA, are detected in saltwater fish tissue of sheepshead red drum and Atlantic croaker. There they are. PFOS concentration does differ by site and species in the saltwater data. PFOS concentration decreases across sites statistically significantly for croaker, sheepshead, and red drum. And then, the croaker and the sheepshead have lower concentrations than the other species at site 1 as well. Sorry, I'll go back to the slide. Too fast. These are the takeaways that we have ascertained from this data to this point. We're still in the process of trying to understand this data in context of the saltwater data. And the saltwater data is en route for publication. And so it has been drafted by Callie Davis, who was with us last year, who took a lot of this data and put it together. But she's drafted the saltwater publication and the freshwater publication, and the saltwater data will follow that once we've had an extensive kind of time to present it and feedback from peer audiences at conferences. Okay, so the next steps for this fish project are to design a monitoring strategy for water bodies across the state. And I say this on October 1st, when funding and environmental sampling is uncertain in the future. And so we're hoping to design this. I've talked to our biological monitoring branch as well as the Wildlife Resource Commission about doing this in the future. And we just have not put anything into action until we were able to look at the data we had and really devise a plan in terms of species, frequency sampling, and how to kind of assess the water bodies across the state. We're also planning to collaborate with the EPA, state and academic researchers to expand capacity to do this a little more effectively and maybe at a grander scale. And then the last step, or the current step, I suppose, is to share with local and state officials and discuss this data with policymakers. That's it. That's the last bit. So I can take any questions if you have them.
All right. I see a question from Elena. Thank you, Franny.
What can you tell me about the sheep's head? Is that a sheep? Oh, sorry. What can you tell me about, I'm most familiar with the sheep's head minnow, which probably is not what this you're referring to. I don't know.
No.
But are the sheep's head and the Atlantic croaker used for human consumption?
Yep.
They are. And so sheep's head are different in terms of their like diet and like lifestyle behaviors and for what they eat. And so sheep's head are often under dock pilings and they eat a lot of barnacles. And so they have a very specific food source that is, close to shore and close to humans, also an invertebrate, but essentially I guess it's an exoskeleton, but we know that those accumulate PFAS differently than vertebrates. Atlantic croaker is more of a, I guess, they don't have anything specific that would lead to any kind of accumulation like this. They have a more diverse diet in the water column, whereas sheep's head are very specific to these locations and they have a different fishing strategy as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were the detection limits the same between the freshwater and the saltwater when you had those comparisons of frequency of detections?
They were. And so we collected the same physical amount of tissue and homogenized it and sent it away. And so the detection limit is predicated on the amount of tissue that's used in the extraction. And so they all used about 2 grams of tissue, even though we sent much more than that in case they needed to rerun things, which did have to happen for some of these samples.
And given that you saw differences between site, but you also saw differences based on size, has somebody smushed all that together to say, accounting for the size differences, did the site differences hold up? Or could it be that there were bigger fish caught at some sites than other ones?
We have done that comparison and I have a couple slides like at the end, but I don't have it included here. And so I can include that when I post this presentation.
Sounds good.
Include it in the minutes.
See, they have a question from Jamie.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, and I apologize if you mentioned this. I was looking more at the fish than at the PFAS. Are the PFAS listed here, the full list of PFAS that were analyzed for, or were there additional PFAS like PFPRA or any of the others?
So these are only the PFAS that were detected. The whole suite that's available to us in 537.1 Mod Max from Gel Laboratories was analyzed. And so there are 56 compounds, including all 14 of the consent order compounds and some of the other smaller PFAS as well. I cannot remember offhand if PFPRA was included in that list. I believe that it was, but I can look at the Excel file and follow up with you about that one.
Okay, great. And I apologize if you listed that. I was looking more at the fish. And you know, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think it is really interesting that the croaker and sheep's head had less PFAS than some of the other species, but had greater detectable levels of PFMOAA and or PFO5DA. That's really interesting, and it makes me wonder a lot about their life history, which you've already talked about a little bit. But I think that's interesting that they showed sort of this reversal compared to the other species.
It is really interesting, and let me go to the next slide. The red ear sunfish that were detected, that had PFO5DA detected in the freshwater samples also have a very interesting behavioral and dietary niche as adults, and they often eat a lot of invertebrates and bivalves on the bed of the river. And so they have a very specific food source as adults. And I don't know that that is the source of this particular compound, but it appears to be correlational, which is never indicative of causation, but it warrants further investigation. And I have not spoken to our collaborator at the Wildlife Resource Commission in a number of months, but I'm curious to hear what he thinks about that as well.
Does the report have any comparison to some kind of screening value about the toxicological significance of the levels as opposed to documenting exposure?
I also did not include that slide in the slide deck, but we have a comparison between this study and a study that was done in Charleston Harbor with similar species, a lot of the same species, and our fish had a greater mean concentration of PFOS for the most part. I can include that plot as well. But yeah, I have not compared this to any kind of toxicological consumption value or concentration at this point.
Yeah. John?
You partially just answered the question, which was, how does this compare to other water data that you've seen or fish data that you've seen? Is it similar? You said it's lower than or higher than it is in Charleston. Is that right?
Yeah, and so it's not all the species are essentially higher because not all the same species were sampled. But the concentrations that were reported from fish in Charleston Harbor the means were slightly lower. When we looked at the fish, especially the freshwater fish as a whole, and compared it to the EPA National Lakes and Streams study, it was comparable. And so I'm just regretting not including these slides because I removed them. But they are comparable, and the concentrations do vary. The EPA Lake study is a huge study, and so they have just an enormous amount of data points. And so it's a great way to compare this data to see where we fit kind of in the world of PFOS and fish. But I'll add these slides before I put this on the
One
internet.
more slide to add. It's just, people may not know this, but Elena actually raises sheep and goats. And if you were to look at the teeth of a sheep's head, it looks like the teeth of a sheep and a human. They look like a human's mouth. And all these teeth.
That makes sense because it eats like the hard barnacles. Parrotfish are the same way because they eat like hard pieces of coral in the ocean. They have a little like
So that could be your next slide, is add a sheep's head.
a smile.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that update. And I think we're ready to move on to what I believe is the last information item, which is the Keymore's consent order study status update that Franny will also provide.
Yes. So I separated this presentation into two separate short ones, because I wanted it to be easy to refer to in the future. But I'm going to give an update on the overall status of all the consent order toxicity studies. And then I'm going to present very briefly the data that we have received through the final report of the rat 28-day immunotox study that was done through the consent order for Naphthalene byproduct 2. After this. Okay, so the consent order requires Chemours to complete these toxicity studies, and I have given periodic updates in the past, and so I will go through that again here, just so we all remember. The consent order includes 12 compounds, 14 if you consider the branched and linear isomers. However, the consent order paragraph 14, which is the toxicity study paragraph, only requires Chemours to test these 5 compounds. And I don't know if it was intentional at the time. I think it may have been from the toxicologist that was a DEQ then, but these 5 compounds have had very different results in all of the aquatic tox studies and the different animal models. And so it was really a brilliant design of the differences in these 5 compounds if they had to choose 5. It is less than the full suite, but these are all very different compounds. Okay, so the consent order requires toxicity studies to be done. It's paragraph 14, if anyone wants to read it in its entirety. But it requires the following studies, which shall be conducted following applicable US EPA, OECD protocols as defined in the US EPA's TSCA, OPPT, or other appropriate programs determined by DEQ. So there were requirements that the labs that Chemours chose must follow these well-established methods. There are 2 categories of tests done. So there were ecological toxicity studies or aquatic tox studies, and this included all of the different kind of levels of biological organization in an aquatic environment in North Carolina, ranging from algae to zooplankton, fish, and then worms and sediment. The rodent studies were a little bit different, and so there were 2 types of studies that were required to be done, a 28-day oral immunotoxicity test and a 90-day repeated oral dose test. And the 90-day is kind of a classical National Toxicology Program test, whereas the 28-day is an immunotox test, and it is one that Dr. DeWitt is very familiar with, but it is a little different than the repeated dose one, and I'll explain why. Little boxes. Okay. In terms of their completion status, this is a table I made showing the completion status of those ecological or aquatic tox studies. The first column are the 5 consent order paragraph 14 compounds, and then you have the 5 animal tests across the top. The check marks mean that it's been completed and we have the final report. We have the final report for nearly everything. The very last test that was conducted was the worms in sediment test for Naphthalene byproduct 2. The in-life portion and dosing portion of that has been completed. We are just waiting on the final report, and it's expected before the December meeting. And so I'm planning to share that at the December meeting. But the rest of these studies, I waited until we had all 5 compounds reported to us to present them to you. But many of them were presented in December 24, and then I presented the chronic Daphnia work in April 25 this year. As far as the rodent toxicity studies, they're in a little bit of a different type of completion status. And so the Naphthalene byproduct 2, so same organization, the 5 compounds are in the first column, and then we have the status of the different tests along the top. The Naphthalene byproduct 2 rat test has been completed, and we have the final report for it. The mouse test has also been completed. And then almost all of these have already been completed in terms of their in-life portion, with the exception of PFO2HXA. That rat test is currently happening right now, and the mouse test is being scheduled. The 90-day tests have not started yet. I'm going to show you some more details about this because this is not a very explanatory slide. So if we're just looking at the rat 28-day immunotox tests, nearly all of the in-life and dosing portions have been completed. So what you're looking at is the start date of the dosing experiment, the end date of the dosing experiment, and the day the necropsy happened. The draft report date, which is the date that the contract laboratory sends the draft results to Chemours. And then the laboratory has a 6-month period where they have the draft report and they take any comments from their contractor or the people in the lab that are reviewing it as well for corrections, clarity. But they have a 6-month set time frame between draft and when they make things final. Just in the event that they don't get any comments, they have a definitive period for a final report. We have received the final report for Naphthalene byproduct 2. PFMOAA has been completed for the rat 28-day test, and we're waiting for the final report. That should be in our hands no later than the end of November. The other compounds tests have, sorry, there's a significant delay between the computer and the screen. The PEPA and PMPA in-life tests have been completed. The one that is currently ongoing is this PFO2HXA in-life portion, and that just started about 2 weeks ago. And so it's a 28-day test, which is about a month long. And so it will continue until mid-October when they will do the necropsy and begin the analysis of all of the tissues and write the report. And so that's underway right now, but we're waiting the final report for 2 more compounds, and then the other 2 are expected in the spring and early summer of next year. As far as the mouse studies go, they're a little behind, and the reason being was that we determined all of the mouse doses, and then we followed that with we've determined the rat doses for the studies and then did the mouse doses second. And part of that was because there was some additional validation steps that the lab had to do for the TDAR assay for mice at this particular location. And so that's why this was delayed a little bit. The in-life portion for 4 of these 5 compounds have already been completed. I'm waiting on the final report. For a lot of them, they're likely going to be in our hands before the summer. But the draft report is still being generated by the lab because they are still analyzing all the tissues from the in-life portion. And for this PFO2HXA compound, they're working to schedule that. And so we don't know the date that that's going to start, but we've already discussed and agreed upon the doses, and they're really just trying to fit it into the laboratory schedule right now. And so when that happens, I'll update you. Okay, so the next steps for these studies, I'm waiting for the final reports, specifically for that earthworm study. When I have that, I'm planning to present all of the aquatic toxicology data together in one presentation in December. And so that'll be all of the 5 tests together, so you can see how the results compare to each other rather than me presenting them separately in different presentations. I'm also waiting to receive and review the final reports for the rest of the rodent 28-day studies. As these are received, I'll present them to you in the way that I'm going to present the next few slides. But we will share those as we get them. As far as the remaining studies, the 90-day toxicity tests are the next step in this whole process for all 5 compounds. And the way that this works is that we were using the 28-day test to ensure that we didn't have any overt toxicity, which we did have in some of the range finding experiments. And then use the doses to inform these longer oral exposure studies. So there's a no effect level in each of the studies. This happens it's a discussion between DEQ, Chemours, and the Charles River, which is the contract laboratory. And together we discuss the doses and come up with ones we are all satisfied with. That is the whole process in terms of status of completion. If you have any questions about this, I can answer them, or I can just go to the next 13 slides.
Let's just go on to the next one and then we'll wrap it up.
All right. So these are the results of the 28-day immunotox test for Naphthalene byproduct 2 in Sprague Dawley rats. Just so we're all on the same page, rodent toxicity studies have a ton of value, and rats and mice are used because they're genetically similar to humans, they're easier to handle than other animals, and they have quick reproduction rates. Rodents have been crucial in advancing lots of areas of research, particularly human medical research. Animal studies allow this empirical investigation of PFAS exposure and to determine these isolated health effects, whereas real world studies or environmental studies usually show you kind of like what is happening in the environment in reality, which is a mixture of many things rather than something specific in a lab. And we know that toxicity of any compound is dependent both on the intrinsic potency of the compound as well as its toxicokinetics in the body and how it's incorporated or excreted. Immune system toxicology is also called immunotoxicology. And this is really just the study of foreign substances in the body and how they affect the immune system. They can alter the innate and adaptive parts of the immune system, and this can lead to a lot of different immune outcomes, including suppression, hypersensitivity, or autoimmunity. The immunotox tests are designed to evaluate immune function and disease resistance, and they can be carried out using in vitro or cellular methods, cultured animal methods, animal cells, or rodent models. For this test, they're using a rodent model. Okay. This test that was conducted at Charles River through the consent order was based on this internationally recognized method, this OECD test guideline. This particular method tests a chemical orally that is administered orally for 28 days to different groups of dosed animals. The 28-day study provides a lot of information on the effects of a repeated oral exposure and can indicate the need for longer term studies and can also be used to inform the concentrations of those longer term studies. One of the critical pieces of this, or the items that consider this test being valid and of good quality, is that the data show a no observed adverse effect level. And so this was a part of the discussion we had about 1,4-dioxane, was that the lowest dose should elicit no effect. And then there should be a dose, like a waterfall of effects through the doses, ideally. And so having a no effect level is important. So Naphthalene byproduct 2 was the compound used here, the objective was to determine the potential toxicity of it when administered to these rats for 28 consecutive days. The final doses were determined using the literature, a range-finding pre-experiment conducted by Charles River, and then the doses were ultimately proposed and agreed upon by DEQ, Chemours, and Charles River. These are the doses. Dose group 1 is considered the negative control, and it has no compound in it, just the diluent material. Dose groups 2, 3, and 4 are the increasing concentrations of naphthalene byproduct 2. And then dose group 5 is the positive control. And so this is a higher concentration that was shown to elicit the toxic effects in the dose range finding pre-experiment. And so we know that this concentration will have an effect, and that's considered the positive control here. And so it's really the 3 doses in the middle that we're looking at the effects for. And this is what the rats look like. Okay, so for this tox test, there are really 2 things that are being used to determine the potential immunotoxicity of this test substance. The first being the TDAR assay, or the T-cell dependent antibody response. And so this is an immune response and an assay that is commonly used for this test to determine the organism's response to the dose. The other immune pieces that were analyzed were the spleen and thymus, their weights, and then also spleen immunophenotyping. And so determining what immunophenotype these other organs had is often used, and we did encourage them and ultimately get them to agree to do it here. Okay, the experimental design details are, I think, pretty straightforward, but the doses were administered orally for 28 days, and they did that by gavage, not by water bottle. The animals were observed daily, measurements were taken routinely. There were different kinds of examinations for neurobehaviors, motor activities, visual cues. They measured body weight and body size. They did all kinds of cage side observations and measurements. For the TDAR assay, so for that T-cell immune test assay, they immunized these animals with sheep red blood cells on day 24. And this is correct and appropriate based on the method. And so they immunize them with another animal's red blood cells, and then they test the antibody response. The samples that were taken in life were blood and urine. And then after necropsy, they collected the internal tissues for a lot of histology and pathology that's very common in toxicology. As far as sample testing went, they did a very common routine blood panel and clinical chemistry panels, a urinalysis. They also did a bone marrow evaluation, that TDAR assay, the T-cell assay. They did histology on all of the tissues, organ weights, and they also did the splenic phenotyping. Okay, I'm going to go through the results of this test. And so these are divided into 3 sections. The first is the different tests and observations and metrics that had no effects reported related to the dose. I spelled changes wrong, but the second is the effects that were reported as changes. And then the third are the effects that were reported as an increase or a decrease. Okay, so as far as the no effects reported for these observations or tests, all of these had no effects reported that were related to the dose. There's a lot of details in the final report, and that ultimately will end up on our website, and we can share publicly internally on the SAB page. But all of these had no dose response, and that's not particularly surprising. The splenic immunophenotyping, the bottom right block, is one of the immune tests that they were doing specifically. And so that had no dose-related effect. And so for the one of the 2 immune tests, there was no dose response. The other is the TDAR assay. And so recall, this is that T-cell dependent antibody response. And this is an interesting set of results because there was no substance-related effects, but there were some effects shown. And so there were no statistical differences in these dose groups compared to the control group, and so the group that had no chemical applied. The positive control group did demonstrate the ability to detect an immune response, and so there was a positive response of the T-cell dependent antibody in that positive control group. And so that just really shows that this test worked, but that the dose groups that we tested did not have a response. There were some changes observed that were not related to NAFI and byproduct 2 dosing. And these were some lower immunoglobulin M values in the first and second dose group females. And they're claimed or reported to be not related to the compound because there was no dose response. So it was just one individual of each of these two groups that had this lower average immunoglobulin M value, but there was no dose response. There was also higher IgM values in males, but that was attributed to just biological variation because there were no immunosuppressive effects associated with this higher IgM response. And so all of these things put together lead to the conclusion that there were no NAFI and byproduct 2 related effects on the T-cell dependent antibody response at the 3 doses that were tested in male and female Sprague-Dawley rats for 28 days. So those 2 tests together, before I get into this other thing, indicate that there were no immunotoxicity effects reported. But there were other effects reported. And so the second part that I'm going to talk about are the ones that just had changes reported. And so these tables, this slide and the next slide, are organized the same way. The dose level is in the first column. The sex, male or female, is in the second column. And then the third column is just the reported effects for dose and sex. So for the first row, it's males, and that's the male response for the 0.3 level, 0.3 dose. The fourth column is the effects that were reported for both males and females at that dose. And so those are the dose-specific responses, but there were no sex differences in that particular response. There's a lot on this slide, and so I'm going to go through it as clearly as I can. So clinical chemistry are things like liver markers, TRIG is triglyceride, glucose, cholesterol. These kind of normal things that are done when you have a blood panel done. There were differences in clinical chemistry in males. And as the doses went up, if I can have a little pointer. So as the doses went up for the males, the clinical chemistry markers that were different increased. And so it went from just the liver marker and triglycerides to having glucose and cholesterol also changed. And then at the end, there was, phosphate, albumin, ureonitrate, all of these other clinical chemistry panel markers were different in males at these 3 different doses. This little asterisk here means that they were statistically different doses, significantly different from the control group. And so not all of the differences were statistically significant, but some of them were, particularly triglyceride, and I can't remember exactly what A also stands for, but it's one of the liver markers. The females had a slightly different response to the clinical chemistry differences. There were no differences seen for the females at the lowest dose, and then the triglycerides changed in the females at the mid dose and at the high dose, but not in a statistically significant fashion. There were also some just dose-specific responses. So there were some slight bone marrow marker changes at the lowest dose for both sexes compared to the controls. And that was seen even still at the mid dose. At the mid dose, there were some blood panel changes, and these were specifically red blood cells, platelet counts, hematocrit and hemoglobin in the highest dose group, but those were not statistically significant. They were just different than the controls. So the real statistical differences were related to triglycerides, albumin, I can't remember what all of these stand for, I should have written it down, and urea. And this is not so surprising with what we know about the toxicity of other PFAS compounds. And one of the health outcomes that the EPA identified for the PFAS involved in the MCLs is cardiac effects through cholesterol. And so it's not surprising that these are some differences that we're seeing here as well.
So is there a dose response for the triglycerides? Does that mean it's even more at 10 than at 3?
Yes.
So it's a little bit more and then more. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and so this second table is organized the same way, but here are the things that were reported as either an increase or a decrease instead of just a change. And so at the lowest dose for both males and females, there were no increases or decreases for these different things that are listed below. In the mid-dose males, they had an increased liver weight and increased weight and size and cellular changes. They also experienced decreased body weights. And so a decreased body weight and an increased liver weight is what was observed for these males. For the females of the mid-dose group, they had increased thyroid and parathyroid gland weights. And so that is one of the organs that helps regulate the way your body retains fat and muscle. And it's often something that is seen in humans as something that's dysregulated as an immune marker and can have health effects in humans. In the highest dose, males were reported to have decreased body weights and decreased food consumption. The females again had increased thyroid and parathyroid weights, except here in the highest dose, both sexes experienced the increased liver weight and size and had cellular changes in their livers.
So again, is there a dose response there in the males between 3 and 10 for the liver weight, size, and cellular changes? It's not significant, I guess, because it's not marked as significant.
Yes, it's so the liver weight and size and the cellular changes were considered adverse, but the female thyroid effects were not. And so I can't remember if there was a significant dose response there or not, but they were both different than the controls. And then the liver weight and size was, yes, so there was a dose response between the liver weight and size and changes in the males, and then just in the females, it was only the high dose.
Right, okay.
And again, the asterisks denote statistical significance, which was really just observed in the body weights of the male rats at the highest dose, but their food consumption was also decreased, and so that
goes together.
Could be related, it's correlative. Okay, and so the conclusions of this test was that there were no NAFI and byproduct 2 related changes in TDAR or immunophenotyping of the spleen that indicated those immunosuppressive effects. Based on these results, the no observed adverse effects level, or the NOEL, was considered to be 0.3 milligrams per kilogram per day in males and 10 milligrams per kilogram per day in females. And that's important. That was one of the conditions of the test being essentially valid, was that there was a no effect level. There was essentially no effects at all in the female for many things. However, so the overall summary, and this is the way that I have interpreted this report to this point. NAFI and byproduct 2 didn't elicit any immunotox effects in this 28-day test, and that was based on the TDAR and the splenic immunophenotyping. The 28-day test did show some changes that were not specific to the immune system, and so this is body weight, liver weight, changes to liver cells, and changes in clinical chemistry that are also associated with liver damage. And this is important because these results can help us interpret the 90-day toxicity tests that also include these liver analyses. And so these were included here so we have a basis of comparison to these longer, potentially higher dosed animals that will happen in the coming future. But that is really my summary of this particular final report. And so I can take any questions. I see Jamie has one, but I'll also make this report available to you so you can look at it in more detail. It's, as most third-party lab final reports, is very long. I think it's 1,400 pages.
Thank you, Franny. We'll start with Jamie on the phone and then see if anyone else on the phone has questions for Franny, and then we'll move to the room. So Jamie?
I have so many questions, but I won't ask them all here. I'm thankful that the board will be able to see the final and complete report. I am a little concerned that one of the findings presented in the report, or that was interpreted from the report, is that because there weren't dose-related effects on the TDAR, and I won't know that until I see those final report results, that it was concluded that Nafion byproduct 2 didn't produce any effects on the TDAR. I don't buy that. I feel very uncomfortable with that wording. If there were effects on the TDAR that were not dose dependent, but were still statistically different from the control, those are test article related effects. So I don't agree with that language. I'm also not concerned that there wasn't any observable changes in immunophenotype. That those types of changes aren't often observed in these types of studies. The TDAR tends to be more sensitive than changes in immunophenotype. I also would like to see what particular tests they use to evaluate the sheep red blood cell specific IgM antibody results, whether they used a commercially available ELISA or if they performed an in-house ELISA. And I also understand that although it was approved by the entire team to use a 50 milligram per kilogram dose of Nafion byproduct 2 as a positive control, I am concerned that that is overtly toxic and that the immunosuppressive effects observed from that dose likely arise from overt toxicity as opposed to immune system specific toxicity. But I think many of my questions can probably be answered with an opportunity to look at the full report and to see the overall results. And just a quick note, one of the important roles of the parathyroid gland is to regulate calcium levels within the body, which can have effects across many different organs and systems. That's all that I have. So mostly comments rather than questions, but you're welcome to respond, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. And so when I was reading the TDAR results, they were definitely ones that I wanted to discuss with you. The changes that were observed were not statistically significant, but I certainly know less about immunoglobulin M than you do. And so I'm looking forward to giving you this report, and so you can look at it a little closer, because I don't have the specific expertise to be able to tease some of these things out. And
yeah, I would be
love to
interested
hear
in
your thoughts on them.
understanding. Yeah, I would want to know what the effect size was of the suppressive effects. So even though these are adult organisms in many different publications, any shift in the TDAR that's different from control, even a 5 or 10% shift, is considered to be a meaningful shift. That is a biologically meaningful shift, even in the absence of statistical significance. And the variability in the results based on the test they used may prevent a biologically meaningful effect from being detected statistically. And again, you know, I spend every day thinking about immune system data, so I probably have some deeper thoughts than most on this particular subject.
Yeah, and they did use an ELISA assay, and I can't remember the company that it was from. It is one of the things I removed from the slides because there was a lot on them. But it is in the report, and it's in a different draft of these slides I can share with you. I just can't remember what it is.
Yeah, great. And I could probably spend the next half an hour talking about all these details, but I'll stay quiet for now.
Okay.
Well, if you'll get a chance to see the draft, which it sounds like you will, that might be a more productive way to dig into it. I take your point about statistically significant results and biologically meaningful ones, and it could be helpful in these type of presentations for the endpoints that are associated with PFAS, either they were the subject of the study, like the immune response, or they've been associated with PFAS, with the endpoints that drive PFAS toxicity assessments, like liver weight, glucose metabolism, anything to do with the thyroid gland, to go ahead and just show the dose response and the variability so that on one slide you can see, well, what did the liver weights do? And what's the magnitude of the difference before you get excited about whether they're statistically significant. You can have a statistically significant difference that's not that biologically meaningful, and you can have some really biologically meaningful ones that don't come up to be statistically significant because of the variability relative to the way the test was done, like Jamie's saying. You can't do that with this many endpoints, obviously, but your last slide, we can get down to things like liver weight, glucose. There's some things that would be good to say. Let's just see them in a way that a toxicologist would typically look at. All doses on the slide, a mean and a variation around the mean with asterisks for the ones that are statistically significant. And that would only be like, 4 additional slides for the ones that looked like they were related to these compounds' mode of action and showed some differences there.
And there was a lot of figures and dose response or, graphs included in this report. And I just was trying to keep this as concise as possible. But I can definitely flag those pages where the relevant graphs and things are, so it's a little bit easier to navigate the giant report.
Anyone else on the phone before we move to Elena and John in the room? Any questions, Gina or David?
This is Gina. I don't have any questions.
All right. Elena, I saw you first and then John.
Okay. My questions are going to be much easier.
Okay.
You talked about the liver cellular response. Histologically, what did they say they saw? Was it hypertrophy, as in the cells are, the liver is just, were the cells bigger, or was the liver just heavier? And on the body, and on the liver weights, was that absolute or relative to body weight or relative to lung weight?
Both relative and compared to body weight were presented in their appendices. The cellular changes were from the histology and also from the blood panels showing liver enzyme changes. I cannot remember what the results of the histology. I think hypertrophy was what it was, but I can't remember, and I don't want to say definitively.
All right, that's fine.
Sorry.
No, I'll look forward to seeing the report. Thank you. I thought it was a very nice presentation, and it's very typical of what has been seen with other PFAS for both the clinical chemistry and the hepatic increases in liver weight and hypertrophy.
John?
In some ways, I think, Tom, you asked the same question, which was the shape of the dose response for the triglycerides, especially because seems the conclusion is that there's no effect at the lower level of 0.3, even though there was a statistically significant change there. But without seeing the shape of the dose response, I really don't know if that would be a no L or a low L.
It was only statistically significant at the middle dose, not at the lowest dose.
No, but you said no L for the 0.3,
Right.
which is the middle dose.
No, the 0.3 is the
was the
low
low
dose.
dose.
Oh, that's the lower dose. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's the 0 is the way that the group numbers were listed is a little confusing, I think.
But in the report, it'll show the shape of the dose response. Is that right? Okay, great. Thank you.
Anything else? Well, there's a lot of value in doing these 28-day tests as a rangefinder, an additional rangefinder with some additional biological endpoints that are relevant to PFAS mode of action before you invest the time in doing the 90-day. exposures. So it's been a long haul, but I can see how the results here help give confidence in establishing doses for the 90-day tests, which are coming. And if you do have draft results for compounds that you're interested in having the board's review of, like Jamie offered, send them along. We've all looked at a lot of PFMOAA data when the state was interested in pursuing that and there wasn't much available. It sounds like if there's a draft report available, that could be helpful.
So the draft report piece of that last presentation, someone else asked the same thing, and I should have changed it or made it more clear. The draft report is not something the DEQ gets. That is a draft report that comes from the lab to Comores, and then when it's final, we get it.
I got you.
And so part of the process of approving the protocols and determining what should be provided to DEQ at the end includes any handwritten notes, computer files, and that's why the PDF is so long. And so if any changes happen from the determined protocol, when we get the final report, it shows all the amendments and any things that may have had to change if an animal had to be necropsied early or, you know, other such things. So there's a lot of documentation in that big PDF, but we don't get the draft report until the lab and their client determine it's ready to be finalized. So I should have included something like that because someone else asked about it when I asked for review of the slides, but I failed to mention it, so sorry.
Gotcha. Anything else? All right, well, thank you, Franny. I think that moves us to the public forum aspect of the meeting, but it requires folks to have signed up in advance. Did we get anybody that signed up since I asked that question this morning? Not in the room, and Dylan says not online. So that moves us to the end, but before we entertain a motion to adjourn, I want to point out that the next meeting would be December 3rd, unless there's one that's scheduled between now and then, but that's the next regularly scheduled meeting. To thank Franny for working on the agenda and Paula for the logistics of taking care of the board members' parking and lunch in the building. Dylan for getting here early and troubleshooting a room that had almost no power and getting us up and running with just a minimal delay. And also for your help with helping people join remotely. I appreciate it. Is there any other business? Hearing none, I'll just review the action items. We're going to post the final April meeting minutes. I've already received, in order to share with you, DEQ's letter on greenhouse gas endangerment findings and vehicle emissions, the state's comment letter, and we will share a revised draft board summary of our review of 1,4-dioxane for board members to review and try to move that toward action at the next meeting. Those are the 3 action items I captured today. It would be appropriate to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right. Elena's going to second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining online. Thanks for those who traveled, and we will see you in December and be in touch online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.